Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something so cold, so brutal, so relentlessly miserable that it makes your worst winter day look like a tropical vacation. We're talking about winters in Edo, Japan, a time when the phrase, just bundle up, meant wrapping yourself in paper, praying to 7 different gods, and accepting that your toes might not make it to spring. This isn't the romanticized Japan of cherry blossoms and elegant tea ceremonies. This is the Japan of frozen rice paddies, houses made of kindling, and the very real possibility that your bathwater might actually kill you. So before you get comfortable in your heated bedroom with your electric blanket and your central heating, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, though I'm guessing most of you are currently much warmer than an Edo peasant ever was. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's think about this for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to survive winter in a country that hadn't invented insulation yet? How did people sleep when their walls were basically fancy paper screens? What did you eat when your entire food supply was frozen solid? Did anyone actually bathe in winter? Or did the whole country just smell like a locker room until April? Could you make it through a single night without losing feeling in at least 3 limbs? Would you last a week before begging to be sent to the tropics? Any tropics? Even the ones with malaria? And here's the thing you're about to find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in Edo, Japan. It's January. It's 1750. The snow is falling, the wind is howling through the gaps in your paper walls, and you're wearing approximately 4 layers of cotton that are about as warm as a wet napkin. Your toes are already numb, your breath is visible indoors, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear your neighbour coughing up what sounds like their entire respiratory system. Welcome to winter. It's going to be a long one, so you've made it through the night. Congratulations. That's genuinely impressive because your house, and let's be generous and call it that, is basically a wooden frame wrapped in rice paper with all the insulation properties of a napkin. Shoji screens make up your walls, which means privacy is a myth, warmth is a distant dream, and every gust of wind reminds you that you're essentially living in an extremely elaborate kite. You open your eyes to discover that your breath is visible inside your own home, not outside, inside. The air is so cold that the moisture from your breathing forms little clouds that drift upward toward the ceiling before disappearing. It's like living in a refrigerator, except refrigerators are better insulated. Your refrigerator back home in the 21st century probably has thicker walls than this entire house. The first thing you notice is the sound. Everything creaks. The wooden frame groans with every gust of wind like it's complaining about its existence. The shoji screens rattle in their tracks. You can literally hear your neighbour's conversation 3 houses down because sound doesn't respect paper boundaries. Someone's arguing about radishes. Someone else is coughing. A baby is crying, and you're hearing all of it in crystal clear audio because your walls are acoustic as a concert hall and about as private as a fishbowl. You try to sit up, and your body immediately protests. Your muscles are stiff from spending 8 hours tensed up trying to generate heat. Your joints crack like bubble wrap. You're 28 years old, but you feel about 70 because sleeping in these temperatures does things to the human body that modern heating has allowed us to forget. Your back hurts. Your neck is kinked, and your extremities, well, you're not entirely sure those are still attached. Looking around your room in the dim morning light filtering through the shoji, you can see frost, actual frost. On the inside of your house, it's formed delicate patterns on the wooden beams and around the edges of the screens where cold air has been seeping in all night. It's beautiful in a this is absolutely wrong kind of way. Frost belongs outside, on car windshields, on grass, not on the interior surfaces of human dwellings. Your house, if we're being technical, is a machiya, a traditional wooden townhouse typical of Edo-period cities. The construction is ingenious for hot, humid summers. Raised floors for ventilation, sliding screens for airflow, an open floor plan for cross breezes. But winter was apparently an afterthought. Or perhaps the architects figured if people had survived this long, they'd probably manage somehow. The floor beneath you is tatami matting, woven rush grass over a rice straw core. In summer, it's cool and pleasant. In winter, it's basically sleeping on refrigerated bamboo. The cold radiates up through the mat, through your thin futon, through your multiple layers of blankets, and directly into your spine. You might as well be sleeping on the ground. Actually, sleeping on the ground might be warmer because at least dirt has some insulating properties. The ceiling above you is barely there, just thin wooden boards covered with more paper, and you can see your breath hitting it and dispersing. There's an attic space above, but it's not insulated. Nothing is insulated. Insulation as a concept won't really catch on in Japan for another couple of centuries. Right now, the prevailing architectural philosophy seems to be, let's make everything as breathable as possible, and just hope people figure out how to not freeze. You glance over at the shoji screen that separates your sleeping area from the rest of the house. It's torn in 3 places. Not because anyone ripped it intentionally, but because paper tears. That's what paper does. Especially when it's been there for months, getting damp from humidity, drying out from the aurora fire, expanding, contracting, and generally being asked to perform a job it was never designed for. You've patched it twice already this winter with spare paper and rice paste, and it's probably going to need patching again before spring. Through one of those tears, you can see into the main room where the aurora sits. The fire's gone out. Of course it has. You banked it carefully last night, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the darkness. But that was 8 hours ago, and apparently the cold won. Now you're going to have to restart it from scratch, which means finding kindling, coaxing embers, and praying to whatever gods handle household fires that it catches before your fingers fall off. The walls aren't even walls in the Western sense, they're removable. You could literally take out the shoji screens and have an open-air pavilion, which is wonderful for summer evening parties, and absolutely catastrophic for winter survival. The only solid wall in the entire structure is the one facing the street, and even that has gaps. You can see daylight peeking through the spaces where the wooden boards don't quite meet. It's like living in a very fancy tent. Outside, you hear the yukikaki, the snow shovelers, starting their morning rounds. The sound of wooden shovels scraping against stone echoes through the neighbourhood. Someone's already up and working, clearing paths, making the streets passable. You should probably get up and clear your own entrance, but that would require leaving the minimal warmth of your blanket cocoon. And right now, that seems about as appealing as diving into an ice bath. Your house does have one advantage, though. If there's an earthquake, and in Japan there's always an earthquake eventually, it'll shake and flex and probably not collapse on you. The lightweight construction and flexible joints mean the whole structure can move without breaking, so you've got that going for you. Sure, you might freeze to death, but at least you won't be crushed. Priorities. You can smell smoke now, drifting in from other houses where more motivated people have already restarted their fires. It's a mix of charcoal, wood, and the faint scent of whatever people are cooking for breakfast. The smoke doesn't stay in anyone's house. It can't. Everything's too ventilated. It just rises up through the ceiling and spreads across the neighbourhood like a communal blanket of soot. This is home. 4 walls that aren't really walls, a roof that keeps out rain but not cold, and enough charm to make modern architects weep with envy and modern humans weep with sympathy. You live in what's essentially an elegant cardboard box, and you're expected to survive months of winter in it. The fact that anyone did is a testament to human stubbornness. Time to get up. Your paper house awaits, along with a day of trying not to freeze in it. Bedtime in Edo winter isn't about comfort, it's about survival. Your futon is a thin cotton mattress laid directly on the tatami mat floor, which is approximately as insulating as a piece of cardboard. You've got a few blankets, also cotton, which trap heat about as effectively as a sieve holds water. The good news? You're not alone. The bad news? That's because your entire family is piled on top of you like a human lasagna, desperately sharing body heat while trying not to elbow anyone in the face. Let's start with the futon itself. This isn't the thick, plush futon mattress you might be imagining. This is a shikibuten, essentially a thin cotton pad stuffed with cotton batting that compresses to about the thickness of a large towel after a few months of use. You roll it out on the tatami floor every night, and every night you're reminded that the floor beneath is cold, hard, and completely indifferent to your suffering. The tatami provides exactly 0 thermal barrier between you and the frozen earth below. It's basically decorative at this point. On top of you goes the keikabuten, your blanket. which is slightly thicker than the mattress but not by much. It's also cotton, because everything is cotton, and cotton is wonderful for breathability and terrible for insulation. It's like trying to stay warm under a beach towel. Some families are lucky enough to have multiple kakabuton that they can layer, creating what amounts to a cotton sandwich with you as the questionable filling. If you're really fortunate, you might have one made with silk wadding, which is marginally warmer and exponentially more expensive. Then there's the matter of positioning. In a typical Edo household, everyone sleeps in the same room, not because they want to, but because heating multiple rooms is a luxury reserved for daimyo and the extremely wealthy. So you've got grandmother, mother, father, 3 kids, and possibly an unmarried uncle all laying out their futons in the same space, arranged around the orori like petals on a flower. The goal is to maximize shared body heat, while minimizing the chances of someone rolling over and smothering an infant. The sleeping arrangement follows a strict hierarchy. The eldest members of the family sleep closest to the orori, where the dying embers provide the most warmth. Children get sandwiched in the middle, benefiting from the collective body heat of the adults around them. And if you're the youngest son or a lowly apprentice living with the family, congratulations, you get the spot farthest from the fire, right next to the drafty shoji screen, where you can enjoy the full Arctic experience. Actually falling asleep is its own adventure. You're wearing multiple layers of clothing because undressing for bed is something only crazy people or rich people do. Your kusode, maybe 2 of them, stay on. Some people wear a special sleeping robe called a namaki, but let's be honest, it's still just cotton, and you're still cold. You burrow under your blankets, pull them up to your nose, and then spend the next hour trying to find a position where your arm isn't falling asleep and your hip isn't grinding against the floor. Your breath creates a little pocket of warmth under the blanket, which is lovely for about 3 minutes until the humidity from your breathing makes everything damp. Now you're not just cold, you're cold and clammy, which is somehow worse. The moisture has nowhere to go because you're cocooned in cotton, so it just sits there, slowly soaking into the fabric and making you feel like you're sleeping in a wet paper bag. Around midnight, you wake up because your shoulder hurts. The thin futon has compressed to nothing under your weight, and you're essentially sleeping on hardwood. You try to shift position without disturbing the person next to you, which is impossible because you're all packed together like sardines. Someone groans, a child whimpers. Your spouse mutters something about radishes again. What is it with radishes? Then comes the worst part. You need to pee. This is a crisis. Leaving the warmth of your blanket cocoon means exposing yourself to air that's probably below freezing. It means shuffling through the dark house to the toilet area. It means coming back to a futon that has already lost all your carefully accumulated body heat. Some people just hold it, all night, until morning. This leads to its own problems, but at least they're warm problems. If you do brave the journey, you have to navigate by memory because lighting a lamp means finding flint, starting a flame, and wasting precious oil. You shuffle across the tatami in the dark, trying not to step on anyone, which is nearly impossible because there are bodies everywhere. Someone's arm is stretched out, someone else is sleeping diagonally. It's like a very cold, very dark obstacle course, where the obstacles are your family members and the penalty for failure is someone yelling at you in the freezing darkness. The cold has another fun effect. It makes you curl up. Everyone sleeps in the fetal position in Edo winter, knees pulled to chest, arms tucked in, trying to minimize surface area and conserve heat. You wake up in the morning looking like a shrimp and feeling like you've been folded in half all night. Because you have been. Your hip flexors are screaming. Your back is curved like a question mark. But hey, you're alive. Some families use utanpo, which are ceramic hot water bottles filled with hot water from the orori and wrapped in cloth. You tuck these into your futon before bed, and for about an hour they're absolutely glorious. Then they cool down and become heavy ceramic lumps that you have to maneuver around all night. If you're not careful, you kick one in your sleep and crack your toenail. But for that first hour, worth it. There's also the issue of air quality. With everyone breathing in the same sealed room, the oxygen gets thin and the carbon dioxide builds up. By morning, the air is thick and stale. You wake up with a headache and a dry mouth, wondering if you're sick or just experiencing the effects of sleeping in what's essentially a very cold cave with 7 other people. Snoring is a major issue. With no separate rooms, everyone gets to enjoy everyone else's nocturnal symphony. Father snores like a bullfrog. Uncle wheezes. The baby makes little squeaking noises, and you're lying there, trying to sleep, listening to this chorus and wondering if moving to the mountains and becoming a hermit would really be that bad. The absolute worst nights are when it snows. The temperature drops even further, and the weight of the snow on the roof creates this oppressive silence that's somehow more disturbing than noise. Everything is muffled. The city is quiet, and you're lying there, unable to sleep, listening to your own heartbeat and wondering if this is the night your house collapses under the weight of frozen water. Morning arrives not with gentle sunlight, but with cold, grey dawn filtering through the shoji screens. You're stiff, you're cold, and you're pretty sure you didn't actually sleep so much as occasionally lose consciousness, but you made it. You survived another night. Time to roll up that futon, put it away, and do it all again in about 16 hours. Because in Edo winter, sleep isn't rest. It's just the time between being awake and cold, and being asleep and cold. Morning has broken, and so has your will to live, but it's time to eat. Breakfast in Edo winter is a special kind of punishment. You shuffle over to your irori, a sunken hearth in the floor that's supposed to be the house's heat source, but mostly just smokes everyone out. And you're greeted with a bowl of cold rice. Not slightly chilled, cold. Because reheating it would require firewood, and firewood costs money you don't have. The rice was cooked yesterday, maybe the day before. It's been sitting in a wooden container called a nohitsu, where it's absorbed approximately all the cold from the surrounding air and transformed into a solid, clumpy mass that has the texture of the wet cement and the temperature of a January morning. Which, to be fair, is exactly what temperature it is, because your house has no temperature control whatsoever. Room temperature and outside temperature are basically the same thing. You pick up your chopsticks with fingers that still haven't fully regained feeling from the night, and you try to break off a piece of this rice block. It doesn't want to separate. Rice, when cold, develops this sticky, gummy quality that makes it cling to itself like it's afraid of being eaten. You finally manage to wrestle a chunk free and bring it to your mouth, where you're met with the delightful experience of chewing something that's simultaneously hard and mushy, cold and slightly sour. Because here's the thing about leftover rice in winter. It ferments. Slowly. The starches break down. Bacteria that would normally be killed by heat are thriving in your food storage because everything is just cold enough to slow their growth but not cold enough to stop it entirely. Your rice tastes faintly off, like it's having second thoughts about being food. But you eat it anyway because the alternative is not eating, and not eating in winter means not having energy, and not having energy means not working, and not working means not surviving. Some families, if they're lucky, have a bit of tsukemono, pickled vegetables, to go with the rice. These are usually daikon radish or Chinese cabbage that's been sitting in a barrel of salt brine, which does two things. Preserves the vegetables and makes them so salty that your mouth puckers like you've been sucking on a salt lick. But the salt is good. Salt is precious. Salt means flavour, preservation, and a reason to drink more water, which you need anyway because you're probably mildly dehydrated from breathing dry winter air all night. The pickles themselves are also cold. Everything is cold. Your bowl is cold. Your chopsticks are cold. The tea, if you're fortunate enough to have tea, was probably warm when someone poured it 5 minutes ago, but by the time you get to it, it's achieved that special lukewarm temperature that's somehow more disappointing than if it were just completely cold. Speaking of tea, let's talk about the morning beverage situation. If your family has managed to get the irori fire going, someone might have heated water for tea, but good tea, real tea, costs money. What you're drinking is probably bancha, the lowest grade of green tea made from older leaves and stems. It's bitter, it's weak, and it tastes like you're drinking hot grass water, which to be accurate you are. But it's wet, it's vaguely warm, and it helps wash down the rice cement so you drink it and pretend it's delicious. If the fire isn't going yet, and it probably isn't because starting a fire from banked coals in freezing temperatures is a whole ordeal, we'll get to later, then you're drinking water. Cold water. From the bucket that's been sitting out all night, and now has a thin film of ice on top that you have to break through with your ladle. The water is so cold it makes your teeth hurt. You can feel it travelling down your esophagus like a freezing snake. Your stomach clenches in protest. This is not how humans are supposed to hydrate. Breakfast in a wealthier household might include miso soup, which sounds luxurious until you realise that making miso soup requires heating water, which requires fire, which requires fuel, and by the time you've done all that, you could have just eaten the cold rice and moved on with your life. But if you do get miso soup, it's a game changer. Warm liquid, fermented soybean paste, maybe some seaweed or tofu floating in it. For about 5 minutes, your insides feel human again. But most people don't get miso soup for breakfast. Most people get rice, pickles, and regret. If you're really struggling, you might have rice gruel, which is rice that's been boiled with extra water to stretch it further. It's like rice soup, except less appealing than that description makes it sound. It's watery, it's bland, and it fills your stomach without really satisfying anything. It's the Edo equivalent of eating sadness from a bowl. Children get the same breakfast as adults because there's no such thing as kid food. A 3-year-old sits there with the same bowl of cold rice and pickles trying to manipulate chopsticks with tiny frozen fingers, while an adult tells them to hurry up because everyone has work to do. Some kids refuse to eat. They cry. They complain that the rice is too cold or too hard or tastes funny. And their parents, who have zero patience for this because they're also cold and miserable, tell them to eat it anyway or go hungry. Most kids choose to eat. The eating happens in silence, mostly because everyone is too cold and tired to make conversation, but also because talking requires opening your mouth, which lets heat escape. You hunch over your bowl, shoulders up around your ears, trying to create a little microclimate of warmth with your own body. Steam from the rice, if it were hot, would rise into your face and provide a moment of comfort. But it's not hot, so there's no steam. Just you and your cold rice having a moment together. If you're eating near the aurora and the fire has been started, you might experience the unique joy of being warm on one side and frozen on the other. Your face is hot from the fire. Your back is cold from the room. You're essentially being cooked rotisserie style, except instead of becoming delicious, you're just becoming dizzy from the temperature differential. Some families say a prayer before eating, thanking the gods for the food and asking for blessings. It's a nice sentiment, though you have to wonder if the gods are paying attention, because if they were, they probably wouldn't let breakfast be this depressing. But you say the prayer anyway because tradition is tradition, and also because it delays the actual eating for a few more seconds. Breakfast takes about 10 minutes, not because there's much to eat, but because cold rice takes time to chew. Your jaw gets tired, your teeth hurt from the cold. Your stomach feels heavy with this dense, starchy mass that's just sitting there like a food brick. You wash it down with cold water or lukewarm tea, you rinse your bowl if water isn't frozen, and you prepare yourself mentally for the day ahead. Because you've just eaten breakfast in Edo winter, which means you're full but not satisfied, cold but technically fed, and ready to face a day of work that will burn off these calories by noon, at which point you'll eat basically the same meal again. It's not the breakfast of champions, it's the breakfast of survivors, and you're surviving one cold grain of rice at a time. Welcome to the most important meal of the day, Edo style. Where the food is cold, the prospects are colder, and heartburn is the warmest thing you'll feel all morning. Getting dressed in Edo winter is less about looking good and more about not dying. You start with your fundoshi, which is basically a loincloth situation that offers zero warmth, but at least covers the essentials. Then comes your kosode, a simple robe that you layer, and layer, and layer again. By the time you're done, you're wearing approximately 4 to 6 layers of cotton, all of which are about as warm as wearing multiple t-shirts in a snowstorm. Let's start with the fundoshi, because we need to address the elephant in the room, which is that you're essentially wearing a long strip of cloth wrapped around your waist and between your legs in a configuration that took you years to master. It's traditional, it's practical for hot weather, and in winter, it's about as useful as wearing a paper hat in a hurricane. The cloth is thin cotton, it covers the bare minimum, and it provides approximately zero insulation to any part of your body that matters. But it's what everyone wears, so on it goes. Over this goes your first kosode, a simple robe with straight sleeves that reaches roughly to your ankles. The word kosode literally means small sleeves, which is hilarious because compared to Western clothing, these sleeves are massive, but compared to the formal robes of the nobility with their flowing floor-length sleeves, these are relatively modest. This first layer is usually the one that's most worn out, most patched, and most likely to have been passed down from someone else in the family. Nobody sees it, so nobody cares that it has a hole near the left shoulder and a stain of mysterious origin near the hem. Then comes the second kusode. This one is slightly nicer, or at least slightly less destroyed. You tie it closed with a thin sash because buttons haven't really caught on in Japan yet, and honestly, tying things is working out fine. The problem is that when you tie cotton robes closed over other cotton robes, you create this bulky knot situation at your waist that makes you look like you're smuggling rice balls under your clothes. But fashion is secondary to survival, so you tie it tight and move on. Third layer, another kusode. By now you're starting to feel like a cotton burrito. Your range of motion is decreasing with each layer. Lifting your arms above your head requires significant effort. Bending over to pick something up off the floor means negotiating with multiple layers of fabric that all want to bunch up in different directions. You're not so much dressed as you are upholstered. If you're wealthy, or if you're dressing for something important, you might have a fourth or even fifth layer. Some of these might be made from silk, which is actually warmer than cotton and has the added benefit of making you look fancy. But silk is expensive, so most people are sticking with cotton all the way through. Cotton that's been washed so many times it's gone soft and thin. Cotton that's been patched with other cotton. Cotton that remembers when it used to be warm. Now comes the obi, the wide sash that goes around your waist to hold everything together. For men, this is relatively simple, a narrow belt tied in the back. For women, it's a whole production involving meters of fabric that get wrapped, tucked, folded, and tied into elaborate configurations that look beautiful and take approximately 20 minutes to achieve. In winter, the obi serves a secondary purpose. It's another layer. It's fabric wrapped around your core, which is smart because keeping your organs warm is generally a good survival strategy. But here's the cruel irony of all this layering. Cotton is terrible at insulation. It's a breathable fabric, which is wonderful in summer when you want air circulation. But in winter, breathable means the cold air comes right through. Each layer does add some warmth through the principle of trapped air between fabrics, but we're talking minimal improvement. You're basically wearing 4 shirts instead of 1. You're warmer, sure, but you're not warm. On your feet you've got tabby, split-toed socks made of, you guessed it, more cotton. These are actually quite clever because the split toe allows you to wear them with traditional footwear, but in terms of warmth, they're socks, thin socks. Your toes are still cold. They're just cold while wearing socks, which somehow feels more insulting than being barefoot. Over your kusode layers, if you're going outside, you'll add a hori, a jacket-like outer garment that's, surprise, also made of cotton. The hori is slightly thicker than the kusode, which is to say it's thick like a bedsheet instead of thick like a t-shirt. It has wider sleeves and is designed to show that you have some level of social standing, which is great for your reputation, but does approximately nothing for your body temperature. Some people, particularly those who work outdoors, wear a tanzen, which is a padded kimono-style garment, with cotton batting between 2 layers of fabric. This is actually warm, or at least warmer than everything else. The quilted construction creates air pockets that provide real insulation. If you have one of these, you wear it over everything else, and suddenly you understand why geese and ducks seem so smug. Wadded layers work. Unfortunately, most people can't afford a tanzen, so they just keep adding regular kusode and hoping for the best. Your head is covered with a zuki, a hood or headscarf because a surprising amount of body heat escapes through your head, and the Edo Japanese figured this out through trial and error. The zukin is, once again, cotton, but at least it's something. It covers your ears, which are apparently very important to keep warm because when they get cold, they hurt with a special kind of aching pain that makes you want to cut them off just to stop the sensation. The entire dressing process takes at least 20 minutes, and by the end of it, you look like a walking textile factory. You're bulky, you're stiff. Turning around requires rotating your entire body because your neck has disappeared into layers of fabric. Reaching into a pocket, if you even have pockets, requires excavating through multiple strata of cotton, like an archaeological dig. And despite all of this, you're still cold. Because, and this is important, you're still basically wearing cotton pajamas. Multiple cotton pajamas. It's better than wearing one cotton pajama, absolutely, but it's not good. Modern thermal underwear made from synthetic fabrics would do more with 1 layer than you're achieving with 6. But synthetic fabrics won't be invented for another 2 centuries, so you work with what you have. The wealthy have it slightly better. They can afford silk underlayers, which actually provide real warmth. They can afford thicker, higher quality cotton. They might even have imported wool, though that's rare and expensive. But for the average person, it's cotton all the way down, layered like a textile onion until you're round, immobile, and still shivering. Women have an additional challenge. They're expected to look elegant while also staying warm. This means their layers have to coordinate. The collar of each inner corsode should be visible at the neckline, creating a layered effect that shows off how many robes you can afford. It's fashion and function combined, except the fashion part is doing a lot more work than the function part. Children are dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing, which means they're also cold but smaller. Babies are wrapped in layer upon layer of cotton, bound up like little fabric sausages, which keeps them warm through a combination of insulation and restriction of movement. They can't kick off their blankets if they can't move their legs. Problem solved. By the time you're fully dressed, you've achieved maximum layering. You look like you're wearing your entire wardrobe at once, which you essentially are. You can barely move, you definitely can't run. But you're as warm as you're going to get, which is to say you're still cold, just less cold than you were when you woke up. And the best part? You get to wear all of this all day long. Taking layers off would mean losing hard-won warmth. So you work in this, you eat in this, you live in this, until finally, mercifully, it's time for bed and you can remove maybe 1 or 2 layers before climbing back under your inadequate blankets. Fashion in Edo winter isn't about style. It's about survival, and survival looks like a cotton mummy. Nature calls, and in Edo winter, nature is screaming. Your toilet isn't a toilet. It's a wooden box positioned over a hole in the ground, usually located outside or in an unheated part of the house. The seat is wood, which means it's the exact temperature of the outside air, which means it's cold enough to make you reconsider every life choice that led you to this moment. The benjo, as it's politely called, or kawaya if you're feeling fancy, is essentially a small wooden structure built over a pit. That's it. That's the whole technology. Humans figured out how to build elaborate castles and create beautiful art, but when it comes to waste management, the solution is a hole in the ground with a box on top. To be fair, it works. But working and being pleasant are 2 very different things. The journey to the toilet begins with the mental preparation. You've been holding it for as long as possible because you knew this moment would come, and you were hoping to delay it indefinitely. But biology is undefeated, so you steel yourself, take a deep breath of warm indoor air, and venture toward the toilet area. If you're lucky, it's just off the main house, in a semi-enclosed space. If you're unlucky, it's completely outside, which means you're about to experience nature in a way you never wanted to. First, you have to navigate there in your multiple layers of clothing. Remember all those corsode you carefully wrapped around yourself? Now you have to unwrap them, in the freezing cold, while desperately needing to pee. This is a race against time and your bladder. You're fumbling with sashes and fabric with fingers that have lost dexterity from the cold, trying to expose the necessary areas without exposing unnecessary areas to the Arctic wind that somehow found its way into the toilet structure. The door to the benjo, if there is one, is usually just a lightweight wooden panel or a cloth curtain. Privacy is theoretical. Sound carries. Everyone in the house knows what you're doing. Your neighbour, 3 houses down, probably knows what you're doing, but you're past the point of caring about dignity. You just want this to be over. You slide the door open and are immediately hit with the smell. Let's talk about the smell. The pit below has been collecting waste from your entire household for weeks, possibly months. In summer, it ferments into something truly unholy. But in winter, the cold actually helps. Things freeze, bacterial activity slows. It's still not pleasant. Nothing about a human waste pit is pleasant, but it's not the biological weapon it becomes in August. Small mercies. Now comes the moment of truth. You have to sit on the wooden seat. The wood has been outside, or in an unheated space, all night. It has absorbed every degree of cold the winter air could provide. It's not just cold. It's aggressively cold. It's the kind of cold that makes you gasp. The kind of cold that your body rejects on a cellular level. It's like sitting on frozen marble, except wood is somehow worse, because it feels like it's actively stealing your body heat. Your exposed skin makes contact and your entire body seizes up. Every muscle tenses, your breath catches. For a moment, you're paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the temperature. This is not what human skin is supposed to touch. Your body is sending urgent messages to your brain. Abort! Abort! This is a mistake! But you can't abort. You're committed. You're here. And nature is still screaming. The hole beneath you is dark and deep. You can't see the bottom, which is probably for the best. Sometimes you hear things down there. Movement. Scurrying. Rats have discovered that human waste attracts insects, and insects are food. So the toilet pit has become part of the local ecosystem. You try not to think about this while you're sitting there, vulnerable, with a rat potentially inches away from your most sensitive areas. If you're a woman, the situation is even more precarious because you're dealing with multiple layers of kimono that have to be lifted and arranged carefully so they don't touch anything. You're basically hovering in a squat while also sitting, trying to maintain balance on a frozen wooden seat while managing meters of fabric in the dark. It's like an Olympic sport that nobody wants to compete in. The cold air rising from the pit below is its own special hell. It's damp, it's frigid, and it's coming directly at you from the worst possible angle. You're being flash frozen from below while the winter air attacks from above. You're a human ice cube forming in real time. Some households use shredded leaves or straw as toilet paper, which you grab from a basket that's also freezing. The leaves are brittle from the cold. They crack when you touch them. This is not the soft quilted experience you're used to. This is wiping yourself with frozen foliage. It's scratchy, it's cold, and it's somehow both too fragile and too rigid at the same time. Wealthier families might have actual paper, which sounds better until you realise it's also frozen, and paper loses all its absorbency when it's that cold. It just smears things around. But again, it's what you have, so you make do and try not to think too hard about the experience. The smell is penetrating your nostrils despite the cold. It's a combination of human waste, frozen earth, and despair. You're breathing through your mouth, which means you're sort of tasting it, which makes everything worse. You're trying to hurry, but hurrying while frozen and exposed is difficult. Your body's not cooperating. The cold has made everything clench up, including muscles you need to relax. If it's nighttime, you're doing all of this in almost complete darkness. Maybe there's moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. Maybe someone lit a small lamp for you. But probably not, because oil is expensive and nobody wants to waste it on toilet lighting. So you're navigating by touch and memory, hoping you don't drop anything important into the pit below. When you're finally finished, standing up is its own challenge. Your legs have gone numb from the cold and from sitting in an awkward position. You have to redistribute all your layers of clothing, retie your sashes, and make sure everything is tucked back in properly. This requires coordination and dexterity, both of which have abandoned you in favour of simply surviving the cold. You exit the benjo as quickly as possible, sliding the door shut behind you and trying to pretend the last 5 minutes didn't happen. But they did happen. Your body knows they happened. You're colder now than when you started. The brief exposure has lowered your core temperature, you're shivering more intensely, and the worst part? You'll have to do this again in a few hours. Some people, particularly the elderly or the sick, keep a portable toilet in their sleeping area. It's just a wooden box with a lid, and it gets emptied into the main pit in the morning. It's not ideal, you're essentially sleeping next to a chamber pot, but it beats making the frozen journey to the benjo multiple times per night. Children are trained early to minimise toilet trips. Hold it as long as possible. Go right before bed. Don't drink too much water in the evening. These are survival strategies passed down through generations of people who really don't want to sit on frozen wood in the middle of the night. Public facilities exist in the city, but they're even worse. They're larger pits serving more people, which means more smell, more rats, and more strangers listening to your most private moments. The seats are worn smooth from thousands of previous users, which is somehow more disturbing than helpful. Most people avoid public benjo unless absolutely desperate. The human waste collected from these pits isn't just thrown away. This is Edo, Japan, where nothing goes to waste. The contents are collected by farmers and used as fertilizer. There's an entire economy built around human excrement. Collectors come by periodically with carts, empty the pits, and sell the contents to agricultural communities. It's called shimago, night soil, and it's valuable. Your poop literally has market value. But that doesn't make the experience of sitting on a frozen wooden seat over a pit of fermenting waste any more pleasant. It just means your suffering has economic purpose, which is either comforting or deeply depressing depending on your perspective. As you shuffle back to the warm part of the house, or at least the less cold part of the house, you make a silent vow to hold it longer next time. Maybe drink less water. Maybe develop superhuman bladder control. Anything to avoid returning to the frozen horror box. Because in Edo winter, even your most basic biological functions become exercises in endurance. The toilet isn't just a place. It's a test of will, a challenge to your dignity, and a frozen throne of regret. You might think that in a country famous for its bathing culture, winter would include regular hot baths to warm up. You would be wrong. Public bathhouses existed, sure, but going to one meant stripping naked, walking through freezing streets, bathing in water shared with dozens of strangers, and then walking back home while your wet hair turns into icicles. Let's start with the basic math of bathing in Edo winter. A hot bath requires water, which you have to carry from the well or river. Then you need fuel to heat that water. Lots of fuel, because heating enough water to submerge a human body takes a tremendous amount of energy. We're talking multiple bundles of firewood or charcoal, which cost money that most families simply don't have. So the idea of heating your own private bath at home, that's a luxury reserved for samurai, wealthy merchants, and people who have both money and a death wish for their fuel budget. This leaves the average person with one option: the sento, the public bathhouse. These establishments exist throughout Edo, marked by their distinctive Norin curtains hanging at the entrance. Blue for men, red for women, though in smaller neighbourhoods everyone just knows where the bathhouse is because it's the building with steam pouring out of it and the smell of wet humanity wafting through the streets. The journey to the sento begins with a decision. Do you bathe today or not? It's not a simple question. Bathing means leaving your marginally warm house, walking through freezing streets, getting naked, getting wet, and then reversing the whole process. You'll be colder during the journey than if you just stayed home and remained dirty. But you're also starting to smell like a combination of old rice, smoke, and despair. So maybe it's time. You gather your supplies, a tenugui, a thin cotton towel that's about as absorbent as a napkin, a change of undergarments if you have them, maybe a small bag with some rice bran or soap if you're feeling fancy, though most people just scrub with hot water and hope for the best. You bundle up in all your layers because you'll need them for the walk, even though you'll have to remove them all when you arrive. The walk to the sento is an exercise in questioning your life choices. The wind cuts through your cotton layers like they're not even there. Your taba-covered feet are already numb. You're clutching your towel and wondering why humans ever invented bathing in the first place. Staying dirty is looking better with every step. At least dirt provides a layer of insulation, you tell yourself. Your ancestors survived without regular bathing. Maybe you could too. You arrive at the bathhouse and are immediately hit with a wall of steam and heat that pours out every time someone opens the door. It's glorious for about 3 seconds. Then you remember that you have to undress in this environment. The changing area is warm from the residual heat of the baths, but it's not that warm. It's also crowded with other people who had the same terrible idea you did. The undressing process is hurried and awkward. You're trying to remove 6 layers of clothing as quickly as possible, while also maintaining some semblance of modesty, which is ridiculous because in about 30 seconds you're going to be completely naked with a dozen strangers. But social conventions die hard, so you turn away, hunch your shoulders, and fumble with your obi while trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Your clothes go into a basket, the basket goes onto a shelf. You grab your tenugui and head toward the bathing area, which is separated from the changing room by a short curtain that does absolutely nothing to contain the humidity. The moment you step through, you're in a different world. A hot, wet, echoey world that smells like soap, sulphur if they have mineral water, and human bodies. The bathing area is a large room with a huge wooden or stone tub filled with water that's been heated to approximately the temperature of lava. Steam rises from the surface in thick clouds. Around the edges of the room are low wooden stools and buckets where you're supposed to wash yourself before entering the communal bath. This is the rule. You scrub first, you soak second. Getting into the bath while still dirty is a social crime that will get you yelled at by every grandmother in the building. You sit on a stool that's wet from the previous person and start the washing process. You dip your bucket into a barrel of hot water and pour it over yourself. The shock is immediate. The water is hot, almost painfully hot, and it hits your cold skin like a slap. Your entire body tenses. You gasp. Steam rises from your shoulders. You're being cooked alive, but somehow it feels good, or at least different from the constant cold. You scrub with your tenugui, working the cloth over your skin that hasn't been properly cleaned in days. Maybe weeks. The dirt comes off in layers. The dead skin cells slough away. You're discovering that underneath the grime you're actually still a human being. Who knew? You pour more hot water over yourself, watching the dirty runoff flow toward the drainage channel that runs along the floor. Finally, you're clean enough to enter the main bath. You step carefully because the floor is slippery with soap residue and mineral deposits. The water in the tub is ridiculously hot. You test it with one toe and immediately reconsider everything. But everyone else is in there, sitting peacefully like they're not being slowly boiled, so you commit. One foot in, then the other. Then you lower yourself inch by inch, hissing through your teeth as your body adjusts to the temperature. And then, once you're fully submerged up to your neck, something magical happens. You're warm. Truly, completely, wonderfully warm for the first time in weeks. The heat soaks into your muscles. Your joints stop aching. Your fingers and toes tingle as blood flow returns to your extremities. You can feel your body unclenching, relaxing in a way you'd forgotten was possible. This is why people brave the cold to come here. This moment right here. The bath is crowded. You're shoulder to shoulder with strangers, all of you naked, all of you sharing the same water that's gradually turning cloudy, with dissolved human residue that you're trying not to think about. Everyone has their own technique. Some people sit completely still, maximizing their soak time. Others chat with neighbors, discussing the weather, the price of rice, local gossip. Some people are nearly asleep, heads tilted back, mouths slightly open, completely vulnerable and completely content. The water is so hot that you can only stay in for about 10 or 15 minutes before your heart starts racing and you feel lightheaded. This is the danger zone. People have been known to pass out in the bath from overheating, which is a special kind of irony in the middle of winter. So you monitor yourself, and when you start feeling dizzy, you climb out. Exiting the bath is its own challenge. You're dizzy, you're overheated, and the air outside the water feels shockingly cold even though it's actually quite warm. Your skin is bright red. Steam is rising off your body. You're wobbling toward your bucket for one more rinse of slightly cooler water to bring your body temperature back to something resembling normal. Then comes the drying process, which is where the tenugi's complete inadequacy becomes apparent. You're trying to dry yourself with what amounts to a damp washcloth. It's not working. You're still wet. You're dripping. But you can't stay in the bathing area forever, so you do your best, wrap the tenugi around yourself and head back to the changing area. Now you have to put your clothes back on while you're still damp. Your undergarments stick to your wet skin. Your cassode layers absorb the residual moisture. Your hair is still dripping water down your back, but you're on a clock here because the warmth from the bath is already fading, and you need to get dressed and get outside before you transition from overheated to normally heated to hypothermic. The walk home is brutal. Your hair is wet, which means your head is losing heat at an alarming rate. The cold air hits your damp clothes and turns them into refrigerated fabric. The warmth you gained from the bath is evaporating, literally, with every step. By the time you're halfway home, you're colder than you were before you bathed. The water in your hair is starting to freeze. You can feel it getting crunchy. Your scalp aches from the cold. You arrive home shivering, hair frozen into strange shapes, clothes damp, body temperature plummeting. You strip off the wet layers as quickly as possible and huddle near the aurora trying to thaw out. It takes at least an hour to feel normal again, assuming normal means the baseline level of cold that everyone lives with. And here's the kicker. You'll need to do this again in a few days. Because yes, bathing makes you colder in the short term. But not bathing means living with the accumulated filth of daily life in a pre-modern city. It's a choice between temporary suffering and permanent discomfort. Some people solve this problem by just not bathing in winter. They wait until spring. They accumulate months of grime and convince themselves that everyone else smells just as bad, which is true but not particularly comforting. Others brave the Sento weekly, treating it as both hygiene and a social event, suffering through the frozen walk for those precious minutes of warmth. Wealthier families sometimes have their own private baths, or can afford to heat enough water for a hip bath at home, where you sit in a barrel with hot water up to your waist. It's not as good as a full soak, but it's better than freezing to death on the way to the public bathhouse. In the end, bathing in Edo-winter is a calculated risk. Trade temporary warmth for temporary hypothermia. Choose between being clean and being comfortable. Decide whether social acceptability is worth possible frostbite. It's just another daily decision in a season full of terrible options. The sun is barely up and you're already expected to work. If you're a farmer, and statistically you probably are, winter means maintaining rice paddies, preparing fields for spring, and doing all of this while your hands are so cold they've stopped responding to basic motor commands. The ground is frozen solid, your tools are basically medieval torture devices, and your back is already screaming for mercy. And let's be clear about something. Rice doesn't grow in winter, the paddies are dormant, the water is drained or frozen, nothing is happening agriculturally. You'd think this means winter is the off-season, a time to rest and recover from the brutal work of planting, maintaining and harvesting. You'd be wrong. Winter is maintenance season, preparation season, and finding literally anything else to do because you still need to eat season. Your first task is checking the paddies themselves. Even though they're not actively growing anything, they still need attention. The earthen walls that hold water during growing season need repair. Freeze-thaw cycles have cracked them. Small animals have burrowed through them. Rain has eroded them. So you're out there with a hoe, which is basically a wooden stick with a metal blade attached at an angle, trying to move frozen earth that has the consistency of concrete. The hoe in your hands is so cold that holding it hurts. Metal conducts temperature beautifully, which means the iron blade has absorbed every degree of winter cold and is now transferring it directly into your palms. Your fingers wrap around the wooden handle, which is somehow also freezing despite being wood, and you start swinging. Each impact of the blade against frozen earth sends shockwaves up your arms. Your shoulders ache, your wrists hurt, and you've barely made a dent in the work. The ground doesn't want to cooperate. In summer, you could slice through soil like butter. In winter, it's like trying to dig through stone. You have to angle your strikes carefully, looking for cracks and weak points in the frozen crust. Sometimes you get lucky and break through to softer earth below. Sometimes your hoe bounces off the surface and nearly flies out of your hands. Which would be embarrassing if anyone was watching, which they are, because everyone's outside working and everyone can see everyone else's failures. Between rice paddies, you're maintaining irrigation channels. These narrow ditches carry water from rivers and streams to the fields during growing season, but in winter they fill with leaves, mud, dead plants, and occasionally dead animals. Your job is to clear them out, which means kneeling in frozen mud, reaching into icy water, and pulling out handfuls of decomposed vegetation that smells like the earth's armpit. Your hands go numb within minutes. They're wet, they're cold, and they're covered in mud that's leaching away any remaining heat. You can't feel your fingers anymore. You're operating on autopilot, watching your hands move but not really connected to them. This is fine. You tell yourself, this is normal. Everyone's hands are numb, you're not special. If you're not working on paddies and irrigation, you're repairing tools. Winter is when you fix everything that broke during the busy season. Hoe handles that cracked. Sickle blades that chipped. Baskets that frayed. You sit in your work area, which is barely warmer than outside, and you try to repair things with fingers that won't bend properly. You're tying knots in rope with hands that feel like frozen sausages. You're sharpening blades on whetstones while your knuckles ache from the cold. Some farmers use winter to make new tools. You're cutting bamboo, shaping wood, forging metal if you have access to a forge. But metal work in winter is its own special hell. The forge needs to be hot, which means standing next to intense heat while the rest of you freezes. You're sweating from the fire while your back is covered in frost from the air. You're experiencing all seasons simultaneously, and none of them are pleasant. Then there's fertilizer preparation. Remember all that human waste from the benjo? Winter is when farmers collect it, mix it with straw and ash, and let it age into fertilizer for spring planting. This means shoveling frozen excrement, which has exactly the appeal you'd imagine. It's cold, it's heavy, it occasionally contains things you don't want to think about, and it needs to be moved from collection points to preparation pits. You're basically a medieval sanitation worker, except everyone expects you to also grow all their food. If you're lucky enough to have animals, a horse, an ox, maybe some chickens, they need care regardless of season. Animals don't stop eating because it's cold. They don't stop producing waste. They don't stop needing attention. So you're feeding them, mucking out their shelters, making sure their water hasn't frozen solid, and doing all of this before you even start your actual workday. The chickens are huddled together for warmth, which is adorable until you need to collect eggs and have to reach into a mass of angry pecking birds who are not happy about being disturbed. The eggs, if there are any, are cold. Sometimes they're frozen. You're carrying them carefully because breaking an egg means losing precious protein, and your family can't afford that. If you have a horse or ox, winter is when you're worried about them constantly. These animals are expensive. They're essential for ploughing in spring. If they get sick or injured, your entire year is ruined. So you're checking their hooves, looking for signs of illness, making sure they're eating enough. They're basically giant, complicated investments that poop everywhere and need constant attention. Some farmers spend winter making straw products. Rice straw from the harvest gets woven into sandals, mats, rope, baskets, and various other useful items. This is indoor work, which sounds nice until you remember that indoors and outdoors are basically the same temperature. You're sitting in your work area, fingers moving through straw, weaving and tying and creating. Your fingers develop calluses on top of calluses. The straw is rough and cuts your skin. Your hands are always covered in tiny scratches that sting when you wash them. The workday doesn't follow a clock because clocks are for people who work indoors. You work according to light, dawn until dusk. In winter, that's mercifully shorter than summer, but you're still looking at 8 to 10 hours of physical labour. There's no coffee break, there's no lunch hour at a nice restaurant. You eat your cold rice standing up in the field, then get back to work. Your body develops a rhythm. Swing the hoe, step forward, swing again, bend, lift, carry, kneel, dig, scrape. It's meditation through repetition, except instead of achieving enlightenment, you're achieving exhaustion. Your muscles burn, your joints ache, but you can't stop because the work has to be done, and there's no one else to do it. Other farmers are working nearby, and there's a strange camaraderie in shared suffering. Someone makes a joke about the frozen mud. Someone else complains about their aching back. You all laugh, even though nothing is funny, because what else are you going to do? Crying doesn't fix the irrigation channel. If you're not a farmer, your winter work is different but not better. Artisans work in unheated workshops. Fishermen brave freezing rivers and coastal waters. Merchants walk through snow carrying goods on their backs. Construction workers repair buildings with frozen fingers. Everyone's working. Everyone's cold. Nobody's happy about it. The work breaks your body down gradually. Your back develops a permanent ache. Your hands are never not rough. Your feet hurt from standing on frozen ground all day. You're aging faster than your years, compressed by the constant physical demands and the cold that never lets up. Lunch, when it comes, is the same cold rice you had for breakfast, possibly with a bit of pickle if you're lucky. You sit on a rock or a log, shoulders hunched against the wind, shoveling food into your mouth mechanically. You're not tasting it. You're just consuming fuel. Chew, swallow, back to work. The afternoon is harder than the morning because you're already tired. Your initial energy has been depleted. Your body is running on fumes and stubbornness. But the work doesn't care. The paddies don't care that you're exhausted. The tools don't care that your hands hurt. The earth doesn't care that you're cold. So you keep going. As the sun starts setting, which happens far too early in winter, you assess what you've accomplished. Maybe you repaired 30 metres of paddy wall. Maybe you cleared 2 irrigation channels. Maybe you wove 3 pairs of sandals. It's never enough. There's always more to do. But darkness is falling, and working in the dark is dangerous, so you gather your tools and head home. The walk back is slow. Your body is stiffened from hours of work. Your muscles don't want to move in any direction except horizontal and sleeping. But you trudge on, tools over your shoulder, looking forward to the minimal warmth of your house and the joy of sitting down for the first time in 10 hours. You arrive home and your family is there, and they've been working too. Your wife spent the day spinning thread or weaving cloth. Your children collected firewood or helped with indoor chores. Everyone's exhausted, everyone's cold, but at least you're cold together. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all again, and the day after that. And the day after that, until spring finally comes and you can trade the maintenance work for the back-breaking work of planting. Different work, same exhaustion, slightly warmer temperatures, because in Edo winter, work doesn't stop just because you're freezing. If anything, the cold makes everything harder. But the alternative to working is starving, and between those two options, frozen fingers start to seem manageable. In Edo, Japan, firewood isn't just a resource, it's currency, it's survival. It's the difference between making it through winter and becoming a cautionary tale. But here's the problem. Firewood is expensive, really expensive. So expensive that most families had to ration it like they were preparing for the apocalypse, which in a way they were. Let's talk numbers for a moment. A bundle of firewood in Edo winter could cost as much as several days' worth of food. Not fancy food, basic rice and vegetables. You're literally choosing between eating and being warm, which is possibly the cruelest decision any human should have to make. And yet, every family in Edo faced this calculation daily. Do we buy more firewood, or do we buy more food? The answer was usually, buy less of both and suffer accordingly. The reason for this price gouging is simple economics combined with environmental disaster. By the Edo period, the forests around major cities had been thoroughly depleted. Centuries of construction, fuel consumption, and general human existence had stripped the nearby landscape bare. The easy wood was gone. What remained was farther away, harder to access, and required more labour to transport. Distance plus scarcity equals expensive, and expensive means most people can't afford it. Firewood merchants knew they had a captive market. You need fire to cook. You need fire for heat. You need fire to survive. So they charged accordingly. They'd set up shop in neighbourhoods with bundles of wood stacked neatly, and people would come by, count their coins, and try to negotiate for just one more piece. The merchants rarely budged. They didn't have to. Behind you was a line of other desperate people who would pay the asking price because the alternative was freezing. Different types of wood cost different amounts. Pine was cheaper, but burned fast and produced a lot of smoke. Oak and other hardwoods burned longer and hotter, but cost significantly more. Charcoal, which was wood that had been slow burned to remove moisture and impurities, was the premium option. It burned clean, produced good heat, and lasted longer. It also cost approximately your entire winter budget, so most families saved charcoal for special occasions. You know, like when grandmother was literally turning blue. This meant most households were constantly calculating fire economics. You'd wake up in the morning and decide, do we light the fire now or wait until after breakfast? If we light it now, we can warm ourselves and maybe heat some water. But that's an extra hour of burning, which is an extra cost. Some families would wait until midday to start their fires, enduring the coldest hours with no heat at all. Just multiple layers of cotton and suffering. The Aurori became the centre of a complicated fuel management system. You didn't just throw wood on and let it burn. You carefully placed each piece, adjusting for maximum efficiency. You used the smallest pieces that would still produce heat. You banked the fire overnight, burying coals in ash to preserve them until morning, so you wouldn't have to use precious kindling to restart from scratch. Every ember was valuable. Letting the fire go completely out was a minor tragedy that meant consuming extra fuel to restart. Children were sent out to gather fallen branches and twigs, which technically was the property of whoever owned the land, but everyone looked the other way because everyone was desperate. Kids would roam the outskirts of the city with baskets, picking up anything combustible. A good stick was currency. A pile of dry leaves was treasure. You'd see groups of children competing for the same fallen branch like it was made of gold. Some entrepreneurial individuals made a living collecting and selling sawdust, wood chips and other remnants from carpentry shops. These were low-grade fuels that barely burned, produced more smoke than heat, and probably took years off your lifespan from the fumes. But they were cheap, and cheap meant accessible. So families would supplement their firewood with sawdust bricks, accepting the trade-off of lung damage for temporary warmth. Bamboo was another option. It grew faster than trees and was somewhat renewable. The problem was that bamboo burns extremely quickly and tends to pop and crack when heated, sending sparks flying in all directions. Using bamboo in your Aurori was basically inviting a house fire, but people did it anyway because bamboo was cheaper than hardwood, and desperation makes you accept risks you'd normally reject. The government tried to manage the firewood crisis by planting new forests and restricting harvesting in certain areas. But trees take decades to mature, and people need heat now, not in 30 years. So the laws were passed, the forests were planted, and everyone continued buying expensive firewood from merchants who brought it from increasingly distant sources. Wealthier families solved this problem by buying in bulk. They'd purchase enough firewood in autumn to last the entire winter, stacking it in storage sheds where it would stay dry and ready. This was a significant upfront expense, but it meant stability. They didn't have to worry about price fluctuations or availability. They could light fires whenever they wanted, they could actually be warm. Imagine that luxury. For everyone else, there was a constant anxiety around fuel. You'd lie in bed at night, not sleeping, calculating how many bundles you had left and how many weeks of winter remained. The math rarely worked out in your favour. Most families ran short before spring arrived and had to make increasingly desperate choices. No fire at all except for cooking. No hot water for any purpose. Just endurance and prayer. Some neighbourhoods formed buying cooperatives, pooling money to purchase larger quantities of wood at slightly better prices. This worked until someone in the group couldn't pay their share, at which point social pressure and shame became currency of their own kind. Owing firewood money was serious business. It meant you were consuming more than your share of warmth, which made you a burden on the community. Theft was a constant problem. Firewood left outside could vanish overnight. Even inside storage sheds, locks were picked, wood was stolen, and families woke up to discover their winter reserves had been raided. The penalties for firewood theft were severe: beatings, fines, public humiliation, because everyone understood how serious the crime was. You weren't just stealing wood, you were stealing survival. The irony is that all this fire, all this burning, all this consumption of wood was producing heat for houses that couldn't retain it. The paper walls and lack of insulation meant that most of the warmth generated by your expensive firewood immediately escaped into the atmosphere. You were basically heating the outdoors at indoor prices. It was phenomenally inefficient, but there was no alternative. The architecture was what it was. Some clever families used heat retention strategies. They'd heat stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and use them as portable warmth sources. The stones stayed hot for hours and could be moved around the house or tucked into beds. This was essentially a firewood multiplier. One fire heating stones that extended warmth long after the fire died. Every family that could afford stones and cloth used this technique. Cooking was another fire calculation. You couldn't just cook whenever you were hungry. You cooked when the fire was already burning, batching your heating and cooking activities to maximize fuel efficiency. This meant eating cold food most of the time because lighting a fire just to warm up rice was wasteful. The fire was for morning and evening, when the whole family needed heat and food simultaneously. The smell of wood smoke permeated everything in winter. Your clothes, your hair, your house, your food. It was the scent of survival, lingering in fabric and memory. Some historians can identify Edo-period artifacts by the smell alone. Centuries later, the wood smoke remains, absorbed into the very fibres of daily life. As winter progressed and fuel supplies dwindled, the social fabric of neighbourhoods was tested. Who would share? Who would hoard? Who would help the widow next door whose supply ran out? These questions revealed character. Some families shared generously, understanding that community survival meant everyone helping everyone. Others protected their own supplies zealously, unwilling to risk their own comfort for others. The fuel economy also created a class of middlemen, people who would buy wood from rural suppliers and resell it in the city at markup. These merchants weren't evil exactly. They were providing a service, transportation, and distribution. But they were also profiting from desperation, and nobody likes that. They were simultaneously essential and resented, welcomed at the door and cursed behind their backs. By late winter, prices would spike even higher as supplies tightened and demand remained constant. The coldest months were often the most expensive, creating a brutal feedback loop. When you needed heat most, it cost the most. When you could least afford to be cold, you could least afford to be warm. Spring's arrival wasn't just about warmer weather, it was about economic relief. The pressure of fuel cost eased. Families could redirect their budgets to other necessities. The constant calculation of burn time versus cost could finally stop, and everyone made silent vows to prepare better for next year. To save more, to buy earlier, to never be this desperate again. Until next winter, when the same cycle repeated, because some problems are structural, not personal. and the firewood economy was built into the very foundation of Edo life. If you think winter is hard for adults, imagine being a child in Edo, Japan. Kids ran around barefoot even in winter because shoes were expensive, and their parents figured that building character was free. They wore the same layered cotton robes as adults, except smaller, and somehow even less effective at keeping them warm. Let's start with the footwear situation, or rather, the lack thereof. Most children went barefoot year-round, their tough little feet developing calluses that would make modern podiatrists weep. In winter, this meant they were walking on frozen ground through snow, across ice-covered puddles, with nothing between their skin and the elements except hope and poor judgment. Their toes turned red, then white, then that alarming purple colour that suggests frostbite is having a party. Parents looked at this and thought, yes, this is fine, this is how we all grew up. The reasoning was partly economic. Children's feet grow fast. Buying shoes or even taby socks for kids was throwing money at a problem that would solve itself in 3 months when their feet got bigger, and you'd need new ones anyway. Better to just let them run barefoot and save the money for firewood or food, or literally anything else. Plus, there was the genuine belief that exposing children to cold made them stronger, healthier, more resilient. This was the original "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger" parenting philosophy. And spoiler alert, sometimes it did kill them. Their clothing was miniature versions of adult kazood, which sounds cute until you realise it meant they were just as cold as everyone else, only smaller and with less body mass to generate heat. A 5-year-old wearing 3 layers of thin cotton is still a cold 5-year-old. Their little bodies couldn't generate enough warmth to make the layering strategy work. They were basically adorable ice cubes with faces. Babies had it slightly better because they could be strapped to their mother's back with a onbohimo or other carrying cloth, essentially using their parent as a mobile heat source. The baby would be wrapped in layers, bound tightly to prevent movement, and then covered with the mother's outer robe, creating a little pocket of shared warmth. It wasn't comfortable for anyone involved, but at least the baby wasn't freezing. The mother's back, meanwhile, was sweating from the baby's body heat, while her front was freezing from the room temperature. It was a beautiful system that made everyone equally uncomfortable. Toddlers, though, were on their own. Too big to be carried all day, too young to understand why they couldn't just take off all the itchy layers and run around naked like they wanted to. You'd see them waddling around the house in their multiple kazode, arms stuck out at angles because the fabric was too bulky to allow them to put their arms down properly. They looked like tiny sumo wrestlers, which was adorable but also kind of sad because they were clearly uncomfortable and couldn't articulate why. Children's work didn't stop because of winter. Kids as young as 5 or 6 had responsibilities. They collected firewood, carried water, watched younger siblings, helped with cooking, and did whatever other tasks their small hands could manage. This meant going outside in the cold, repeatedly, all day long. They'd come back in with their hands blue and their noses running, and their parents would tell them to warm up by the fire for 2 minutes before sending them out again. The runny nose situation deserves its own mention. Every child in Edo winter had a perpetually running nose. The cold air irritated their nasal passages, causing constant drainage that they'd wipe with their sleeves because tissues didn't exist, and stopping to find a cloth was inefficient. Their sleeves developed crusty patches of dried mucus that no amount of washing could fully remove. It was disgusting. It was universal. It was just part of childhood. School, for those lucky enough to attend, was held in unheated buildings. Temple schools or terracotta would have dozens of children huddled together, trying to learn to read and write while their fingers were too cold to hold brushes properly. The teacher would have a small hibachi for personal warmth, but the students got nothing except each other's body heat, and the knowledge that education was a privilege they should be grateful for, frostbite and all. The children would sit on the floor because chairs weren't really a thing, their legs folded under them in Caesar position, which cut off circulation and made their feet go numb even faster than the cold alone would have. They'd be there for hours trying to practice calligraphy with hands that shook from cold, producing wobbly characters that their teacher would criticize without acknowledging that writing beautifully is hard when you can't feel your fingers. Play happened anyway because children are resilient and adaptable, and also kind of insane. They'd go outside during breaks and play tag, or hanetsuki, a badminton-like game with wooden paddles and a feathered shuttle. They'd build snow sculptures, have snowball fights, and generally act like the fact that they couldn't feel their extremities was no reason to stop having fun. Adults would watch this with a mixture of admiration and confusion, wondering when exactly they lost the ability to ignore physical discomfort in favour of joy. Winter games had their own special quality. Playing in the snow meant getting wet, and getting wet meant being even colder when you went back inside. But children didn't think about consequences. They'd play until they were soaked through, their cotton robes heavy with melted snow, and then they'd come inside shivering and confused about why they felt so terrible. Parents would strip off the wet layers, hang them by the fire to dry, which they wouldn't, and wrap the child in whatever dry clothing remained. Children also served as human hot water bottles. In family sleeping arrangements, kids were positioned strategically between adults to maximise warmth distribution. A child would go to sleep wedged between parents or grandparents, providing heat to both, while receiving warmth from neither because adults are heat thieves. The kid would wake up in the morning squashed, unable to move, but at least not frozen solid. Illness was a constant threat. Children's immune systems were fighting a war on multiple fronts: cold exposure, malnutrition, crowded living conditions, and whatever diseases were circulating through the population. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia. A cough could last all winter. Childhood mortality rates were high, and winter was a significant contributor. Some children simply didn't make it to spring, their small bodies unable to withstand the accumulated stress of months of cold. But the ones who survived became incredibly tough. They developed an immunity to cold that seemed almost supernatural. They could play in snow without complaint, walk on ice without slipping, and generally exist in conditions that would hospitalise a modern child. This wasn't because Edo children were somehow biologically superior. It was because they had no choice: adapt or suffer. Most chose to adapt by simply ignoring the suffering. There was also a philosophical element to this hardship. Parents believed that struggle in childhood created strong adults. A child who had never experienced cold couldn't be trusted to handle adversity later in life. So they didn't shelter their children from winter. They exposed them to it, deliberately, as a form of education. The cold was a teacher, and the lesson was endurance. Mealtimes for children were the same as adults. Cold rice, pickles, and disappointment. There was no special kid food, no warm milk, no comforting soup made just for them. You ate what the family ate, and you were grateful for it. Children who complained about the cold food were told about how much harder things were when their parents were young, which is a parenting tradition that transcends cultures and centuries. Bath time, when it happened, was a whole family affair. Children went to the centre with their parents, which meant navigating all the same frozen streets and temperature shocks as adults, just with shorter legs and less understanding of why this was happening. They'd sit in the too hot water, which felt scalding on their cold skin, and they'd cry or complain until they adjusted. Then they'd have to make the frigid walk home, hair wet, body temperature plummeting. Younger children sometimes had accidents, bedwetting situations, because getting up in the middle of a freezing night to use the benjo was too daunting even for bladder control. The wet futon would then need to be dealt with, which in winter meant it would freeze before it could dry. So the child would just sleep on a partially frozen urine-scented futon until someone could properly wash and dry it, which might not happen for days. Clothing hand-me-downs were universal. The oldest child got new clothes, kind of. Everyone else wore whatever the previous child had outgrown. By the time clothes reached the youngest child, they were patches holding together other patches, so worn and thin they barely qualified as fabric. But they were layers, and layers were the strategy, so even nearly transparent cotton counted. Despite all this suffering, children laughed. They played. They found joy in small things: a sunny afternoon, a day when the fire stayed lit all day, a rare piece of warm food, a game with friends. They were resilient in ways that adults had forgotten how to be, finding happiness in the margins of hardship. And when spring finally came, these children emerged tougher, stronger, more capable of handling whatever life threw at them next. They'd survived an Edo winter, which was no small feat for a tiny human in thin cotton with bare feet. They were survivors, whether they realised it or not. Because childhood in Edo winter wasn't about being protected or coddled. It was about learning that the world was harsh, that survival required toughness, and that complaining didn't make the cold go away. Valuable lessons, perhaps, but delivered with a brutality that modern child development experts would find absolutely horrifying. Let's talk about the wind. The Japanese winter wind, particularly in Edo, was legendarily brutal. It whipped through the city streets, sliced through your paper walls like they weren't even there, and made every outdoor activity feel like a personal attack from the weather gods. The wind in Edo wasn't just cold, it was aggressive, it had personality, and that personality was cruel. It came howling down from the mountains, picked up speed across the Kanto plain, and then funneled through the narrow streets of the city like a frozen river looking for victims. The traditional architectural layout of Edo, with its grid of streets and alleys, essentially created wind tunnels that amplified the gusts. You'd turn a corner and get hit with a blast of air so cold it felt solid. They called the worst of it the karakazi, the dry winter wind that blew from the northwest. It earned its name by being absolutely merciless. This wasn't a gentle breeze that made tree branches sway poetically. This was wind that knocked over market stalls, tore thatch from roofs, and made walking in a straight line a legitimate challenge. You'd lean into it at a 45-degree angle just to make forward progress, looking like a mime pretending to walk against an invisible wall, except the wall was very real and made of frozen air. The wind didn't just make you cold, it made you colder than you should have been. This is where wind chill comes in, though obviously the Edo Japanese didn't have that term. They just knew that on windy days the cold penetrated deeper. Your multiple layers of cotton, which provided some protection against still air, became useless when wind was involved. The air blew right through the weave of the fabric, stealing your body heat with ruthless efficiency. You could be wearing 6 layers and still feel like you were naked. Your face bore the brunt of it. You couldn't cover your face completely because you needed to see and breathe, so your cheeks, nose and forehead were exposed to the relentless assault. Within minutes your skin would turn red, then start to hurt, then go numb. Your eyes watered from the cold wind, and then the tears would freeze on your eyelashes, creating tiny icicles that made blinking uncomfortable. Your nose ran constantly, and the mucus would freeze on your upper lip if you didn't wipe it away quickly enough. The wind carried things: dust, ash from fires, bits of straw, occasionally someone's hat. Walking through Edo on a windy day meant being pelted with airborne debris. You'd arrive at your destination covered in a fine layer of grit, your eyes gritty and irritated, your throat dry from breathing through your mouth to avoid the worst of the assault. It was like being sandblasted, but with cold and disappointment instead of sand. Inside your house, the wind was equally invasive. Remember those shoji screens? The wind remembered them too, and it laughed at them. The screens would rattle in their frames, creating a constant background noise that was somehow both soothing and anxiety-inducing. You knew those rattles meant cold air was finding its way inside, but the sound was so constant that it became a kind of white noise. The wind would find every gap, every crack, every poorly fitted panel, and exploit it mercilessly. On particularly windy nights, you could watch the shoji screens flex and bow inward, the paper bending under the pressure of the gusts. Sometimes they'd tear. You'd wake up to discover a new hole in your wall, which meant another repair job, more precious rice paste, more careful patching. The wind was essentially vandalizing your house on a regular basis, and there was nothing you could do about it except fix the damage and wait for it to happen again. The Aurori fire became a victim of the wind too. Gusts would find their way down through the roof, creating downdrafts that would blow smoke back into the room instead of letting it rise naturally. You'd be sitting there, trying to warm yourself, and suddenly you're engulfed in smoke, coughing and crying while the fire sputters and threatens to go out. You'd have to adjust your position, try to block the draft with your body, or stuff rags into gaps to redirect the airflow. It was constant negotiation with invisible forces. Sleeping was harder on windy nights. The noise alone was disruptive. The rattling screens, the creaking timbers, the howling through the eaves that sounded like angry spirits. But beyond the noise, the wind made the house colder. All that air infiltration meant your carefully banked fire's residual heat was being sucked away. You'd wake up multiple times, shivering, pulling your blankets tighter, wondering if the house would just blow away entirely and save everyone the trouble of freezing to death. Working outside in the wind was its own form of torture. Farmers trying to repair paddies would have dirt blown into their faces. Their tools would be harder to control because every motion had to account for wind resistance. A simple task like carrying something light, a basket, a bundle of straw, became an exercise in frustration, as the wind would try to rip it from your hands or blow it off course. You'd be walking in one direction, and the wind would physically push you sideways. The worst part was that the wind was unpredictable. It would die down for a few minutes, lulling you into thinking maybe today wouldn't be so bad. You'd step outside with confidence, perhaps even a spring in your step, and then, boom, a gust would hit you like a frozen fist, reminding you that hope is for people who don't live in Edo winters. The wind was a trickster, offering false security before delivering punishment. Street vendors had the toughest time. They'd set up their stalls in the morning, carefully arranging their goods, and then spend the entire day fighting to keep everything from blowing away. Fabric would flutter and tear. Papers would scatter. Lightweight items would become airborne projectiles. They'd tie things down, weigh them with stones, and still lose merchandise to particularly strong gusts. It was retail in hard mode. The wind also affected social life. On really windy days, people stayed inside as much as possible. Visiting neighbours became an expedition that required serious motivation. The streets would be emptier, the city quieter except for the howling. It was like the wind created temporary isolation, forcing everyone into their own little cold prisons until it decided to calm down. Walking to the bathhouse on a windy day was especially brutal. You'd be heading there specifically to get warm, but the journey would chill you so thoroughly that recovering took twice as long. The wind would find every opening in your clothing, every gap where your collar didn't quite close or your obi didn't quite seal. It would sneak in and steal warmth from your core, your very centre, leaving you feeling hollow and cold from the inside out. Children seemed less bothered by the wind, possibly because they were closer to the ground, and therefore in a slightly less intense wind zone, or possibly because children are partly insane. They'd play in it, running against the gusts and laughing when they got knocked over. Adults would watch this with a mixture of envy and concern, wondering when they lost the ability to find joy in physical discomfort. The wind dried everything out. Your skin would crack and bleed from the constant exposure to cold, dry air. Your lips would chap so badly that smiling hurt. Your hands, already rough from work, would develop deep cracks that wouldn't heal all winter. The wind was essentially exfoliating everyone against their will, removing moisture and leaving behind damaged skin that had no way to recover. At night, lying in your futon, you could hear the wind's full performance. It would whistle through gaps, creating eerie sounds that range from low moans to high-pitched keening. It would make the whole house creak and groan like a ship at sea. Some people found it peaceful, the way some people find horror movies relaxing. Most people just found it disturbing. The wind made fire more dangerous. On windy days, the risk of house fires increased dramatically. A single spark could be picked up and carried to dry thatch or wooden walls. Entire neighbourhoods could go up in flames if the wind was strong enough and the fire got loose. So on particularly gusty days, people were even more careful with their irori, banking fires earlier, watching them more closely, ready to extinguish at the first sign of wayward embers. There was no escaping it. The wind found you wherever you were, inside, outside, working, sleeping. It was always there, a constant presence that you had to adapt to and endure. Unlike the cold, which you could sometimes mitigate with layers and fire, the wind was an active force that sought you out. Some people tied cloth around their faces on windy days, creating makeshift masks that blocked some of the direct assault. This helped with the face-freezing situation, but made breathing harder and created a damp patch of frozen condensation from your breath. You were trading one discomfort for another, which was basically the Edo winter experience in a nutshell. The wind was also unpredictable in duration. Some days it would blow hard for an hour and then stop. Other days it would last for days, a relentless assault that ground everyone down mentally and physically. You couldn't plan around it. You just had to deal with it whenever it decided to show up. And when it finally did calm down, usually just before spring, the relief was palpable. The city would emerge from its houses grateful for the stillness, for air that didn't attack, for the ability to walk without fighting invisible forces. The wind had been defeated, at least temporarily, and everyone celebrated by going outside and doing absolutely nothing except standing there, breathing peacefully and not being pushed around. Because in Edo winter, the wind wasn't weather. It was an opponent, a relentless adversary that never got tired, never gave up, and never showed mercy. And you fought it every single day until spring finally showed up and told it to take a break. One advantage of Edo winter: your food didn't spoil, not because of any clever preservation technique, but because everything was frozen solid. Rice, vegetables, dried fish. All of it turned into edible ice sculptures that required significant effort to thaw before you could eat them. Let's start with the storage situation. Most families kept their food supplies in a kura, a thick-walled storehouse, or more commonly in wooden boxes and ceramic jars stacked in the coolest part of the house. And by coolest we mean coldest, because the entire house was cold. There was no warm part, there was just the slightly less cold part near the orori, and you definitely weren't storing food there because that's where people sat and where sparks occasionally flew. Rice, the cornerstone of the Japanese diet, was stored in large wooden containers or barrels. In winter, this rice absorbed the cold from the surrounding air and transformed into something with the consistency of small rocks. Each grain became hard, individual, and completely unappetizing. When you reached into the barrel to scoop out rice for cooking, your hand would come back numb from the contact with frozen grain. It was like reaching into a barrel of cold gravel. Cooked rice, if you had leftovers, which most families did because cooking small batches was fuel inefficient, would be stored in an ohitsu, a wooden container designed to keep rice fresh. In summer, this worked beautifully. In winter, it became a rice preservation chamber that kept your leftovers at approximately the temperature of a winter morning, which is to say frozen. The rice would form a solid mass that had to be broken apart with a wooden spoon, and even then, you'd get chunks rather than individual grains. Vegetables had their own storage challenges. Root vegetables like daikon radish, carrots, and burdock root were kept in wooden boxes covered with straw or buried in the ground if you had access to earth that wasn't frozen solid. The cold helped preserve them, which was good, but it also made them harder to prepare. A frozen daikon was basically a white wooden club. You couldn't cut it. You couldn't grate it. You had to let it thaw first, which took time, or you had to hack at it with a knife while risking your fingers to produce chunks that could eventually be cooked. Pickled vegetables, the tsukemono that accompanied every meal, were stored in ceramic barrels filled with salt brine or rice bran. In winter, this brine would partially freeze, creating a slushy mixture that was difficult to fish vegetables out of. You'd plunge your hand into icy, salty liquid, searching for a piece of daikon or cucumber, and pull it out with fingers that immediately started hurting from the cold. The pickles themselves would be frigid and extra firm, requiring several minutes at room temperature before they were soft enough to chew properly. Dried fish, a protein staple, was hung from the rafters or stored in containers. The cold kept it from rotting, but it also made it even harder and drier than dried fish already is. You're talking about fish that's been preserved through drying, and then frozen on top of that. It was like trying to eat fish-flavoured wood. It needed to be soaked in water, which was also cold for extended periods before it could be incorporated into meals. Biting directly into dried fish in winter was a good way to crack a tooth. Miso paste stored in wooden barrels would freeze partially in cold storage areas. The top layer would harden while the bottom remained semi-solid, creating interesting texture challenges when you tried to scoop some out for soup. You'd have to break through the frozen crust with a wooden paddle, which sometimes required more force than seemed reasonable for a condiment. Soy sauce, stored in ceramic bottles, wouldn't freeze completely because of its salt content, but it would get extremely thick and syrupy in the cold. Pouring it became an exercise in patience as it slowly glopped out of the container like cold honey. By the time you'd poured enough for your meal, your hand was frozen from holding the cold ceramic bottle. Some families were fortunate enough to have access to a storage cellar, dug into the ground where temperatures were more stable. These underground spaces stayed cool in summer and slightly warmer than outside in winter, creating a more moderate environment for food storage. But digging a cellar required space, permission if you were renting, and labour, so most urban families didn't have this luxury. They made do with above-ground storage and accepted that everything would be frozen for months. The freezing actually created a preservation system that worked remarkably well for some foods. Meat, which was rare in most diets but occasionally available, would freeze solid and stay preserved for weeks. The same bacteria that would cause spoilage in warmer temperatures were dormant in the cold. So while the texture of frozen, then thawed meat wasn't ideal, at least it wasn't rotten. Small victories. Fresh vegetables, which were scarce in winter anyway, had to be used quickly, or they'd freeze and turn to mush upon thawing. Leafy greens became crystallized versions of themselves, their cell walls bursting from ice crystal formation. When thawed, they'd collapse into a soggy, unappetizing pile that was technically still food, but barely. This is why winter diets relied so heavily on preserved and pickled foods. They handled freezing better than fresh produce. Tofu, a protein source for many families, presented special challenges. Fresh tofu would freeze solid, completely changing its texture. When thawed, it became spongy and porous, which some people actually liked because it absorbed flavours better in stews. This accidental technique, freeze-dried tofu or koya tofu, became a deliberate preservation method. But if you wanted soft, silky tofu, winter wasn't your season. Oil and fats would solidify in the cold. Sesame oil, stored in small bottles, would turn thick and cloudy. You'd have to warm the bottle by the fire just to get the oil to pour, which required planning ahead because spontaneous cooking wasn't really possible when your ingredients needed to be thawed first. Sake, the rice wine that many families kept for special occasions or medicinal purposes, wouldn't freeze due to its alcohol content, but it would get very cold. Drinking cold sake in winter was theoretically refreshing but practically masochistic. Most people who drank sake in winter would warm it by the fire first, creating one of the few intentionally hot beverages people consumed regularly. The storage areas themselves became treacherous. Reaching into dark, cold storage spaces meant potentially encountering frozen condensation, icy surfaces, or even the occasional frost pattern that had formed on the inside of containers. You'd need to keep a cloth handy to wipe ice from lids and surfaces just to access your food. Water storage deserves special mention. Water was kept in large ceramic vessels or wooden barrels, and in the coldest parts of winter, it would freeze completely. You couldn't just scoop out water for cooking or drinking. You had to break through the ice layer with a wooden or metal tool, creating a hole to access the liquid water below. Sometimes the entire container would freeze, and you'd need to bring it near the fire to melt enough for use. This meant planning was essential. You couldn't decide to cook something and then start the process. You had to think hours ahead. Need rice for dinner? Start thawing it at lunch. Want to make soup? Begin preparing ingredients in the afternoon. Everything took longer because everything started frozen. Some foods actually improved with freezing. Mochi, rice cakes that were made in large batches during New Year celebrations, would harden naturally in the cold. This made them easier to store and actually extended their shelf life. To eat them, you'd toast them over the fire, and they'd puff up and become soft and chewy again. It was one of winter's few culinary pleasures, watching frozen mochi transform into something delicious. But most foods just became harder to work with. Dried seaweed, already brittle, would become even more fragile in the cold, crumbling at the slightest touch. Dried mushrooms would need extended soaking in cold water, which meant they took even longer to reconstitute than usual. Everything required more time, more effort, and more patience. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In a season when you wanted food preparation to be quick so you could stay near the fire, every step took twice as long because you were fighting frozen ingredients. Cooking became a multi-stage process. Thaw, prepare, cook, eat, freeze again if there were leftovers. Children were often sent to retrieve food from storage, which they hated because it meant leaving the warmth of the Edo-era area and venturing into the cold zones of the house. They'd return with numb fingers, clutching frozen vegetables or rice containers, already dreading the next time they'd be sent on a similar mission. Wealthier families had servants to deal with frozen food retrieval and preparation, which was perhaps the greatest luxury of all, not having to personally handle frozen daikon at 6 in the morning. But for most families, food storage management was a daily task that everyone participated in, taking turns venturing into the cold to gather ingredients. The transition from winter to spring was marked not just by warmer weather, but by the gradual thawing of the food supply. Storage areas would warm up, ice would melt, and suddenly you could access your food without a battle. Rice would return to normal consistency. Vegetables would be cuttable. Water would be liquid. These small changes felt like enormous improvements, like civilization returning after months of primitive survival. Because in Edo winter, even eating required planning, effort, and a willingness to work with ingredients that had turned into frozen versions of themselves. Your food was preserved, yes, but it was preserved in the most inconvenient way possible, as solid blocks of former nutrition that required time, warmth, and determination to transform back into something edible. At least it didn't spoil. When your food is frozen solid, bacteria aren't really an issue. Neither is taste, because everything tastes like cold anyway. But you survived, one frozen grain of rice at a time, counting down the days until spring when food could be food again instead of an ice sculpture you occasionally ate. Getting sick in Edo winter wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. There were no antibiotics, no modern medicine, and doctors who thought most illnesses were caused by imbalances in your chi. If you caught a cold, you treated it with herbal remedies, rest, and prayer in that order. Let's start with the basic reality. Everyone got sick in winter. The combination of cold exposure, malnutrition, crowded living conditions, and general stress on the immune system meant that illness wasn't a matter of if, but when. And once one person in a household got sick, everyone else was basically doomed because you all slept in the same room, shared the same air, and touched the same surfaces. Germ theory wouldn't be understood for another century, so people just accepted that illness spread mysteriously, like a curse that jumped from person to person. A simple cold, the kind of thing you'd treat with over-the-counter medicine, and a day off work in modern times was a serious concern in Edo winter. It started with the usual symptoms: scratchy throat, runny nose, body aches. But in a cold house with no way to properly rest or recover, that simple cold could easily progress into something worse. Bronchitis, pneumonia, infections that your weakened body couldn't fight off. The cold wasn't what killed you directly. It was what came after the cold that was dangerous. Medical care was available, but it was expensive and not particularly effective. Doctors in Edo practiced a combination of Chinese medicine, Japanese folk remedies, and pure guesswork. They believed in the concept of ki, the life force that flowed through your body, and most treatments focused on restoring balance to this energy. This meant herbal medicines, acupuncture, moxibustion where they burned herbs on your skin, and dietary recommendations that were sometimes helpful and sometimes completely random. If you developed a fever, the treatment might include drinking bitter herbal concoctions made from plants like ginger, licorice root, and various other ingredients that tasted like punishment. These were brewed into teas that you'd drink while trying not to gag, hoping that the medicine would drive out whatever evil spirits or imbalanced energies were causing your illness. Sometimes these remedies actually helped, because some traditional medicines do have legitimate therapeutic properties. Often they did nothing except make you wish you'd just died quickly. Respiratory illnesses were particularly common and particularly deadly. Living in smoke-filled houses with poor ventilation meant everyone's lungs were already compromised. Add a bacterial or viral infection to already irritated airways, and you had a recipe for disaster. People would develop deep, rattling coughs that lasted for weeks. They'd cough up things that suggested their lungs were disintegrating from the inside, and there was nothing to do except rest, which was hard when you still had to work because not working meant not eating. The coughing itself was exhausting. Imagine coughing so hard and so frequently that your ribs hurt, your throat is raw, and you can't sleep because every time you lie down the coughing gets worse. Now do that in a freezing house where every cough produces a visible cloud of breath moisture, and every deep breath of cold air triggers another coughing fit. It was a vicious cycle that wore people down physically and mentally. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called, was a constant threat. This bacterial infection of the lungs was highly contagious and often fatal. Victims would waste away over months or years, coughing up blood, losing weight, growing progressively weaker. There was no cure, no treatment that actually worked, just slow decline and death. Families watched helplessly as loved ones deteriorated, knowing there was nothing they could do except keep them comfortable and pray. Children were especially vulnerable. Their immune systems were still developing. Their bodies were smaller with less reserves, and they were exposed to the same harsh conditions as adults, but with fewer coping mechanisms. Childhood illnesses that modern medicine handles easily, whooping cough, measles, influenza, were killers in Edo winter. Parents lived with the constant fear that their child wouldn't make it through the season, and that fear was well-founded. Infant and child mortality rates were staggering. The elderly faced similar risks. As bodies aged and immune systems weakened, the ability to fight off infections diminished. An old person who caught a cold in December might not see spring. Families knew this, which is why grandparents got the spots closest to the fire, the warmest blankets, and the best food. It was triage based on vulnerability, trying to give the most fragile members of the household the best chance at survival. Frostbite and hypothermia-related complications were their own category of winter illness. Toes and fingers that turned black from cold exposure would become infected. The tissue would die, gangrene would set in, and without antibiotics or modern surgical techniques, amputation might be the only option. And amputation in Edo, Japan meant a person holding you down, while someone else cut off your dead toe with a saw and no anesthesia. Most people preferred to take their chances with the infection. Chilblains, a painful condition caused by exposure to cold and poor circulation, affected almost everyone. Your fingers, toes, ears, and nose would develop swollen, itchy, painful lesions that could last all winter. They'd itch like crazy, but scratching made them worse. They'd ache and throb, especially when you tried to warm up. There was no real treatment except waiting for spring and trying not to scratch yourself raw. The diet deficiencies of winter contributed to illness. Without fresh vegetables or varied nutrition, people developed problems related to vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, could cause bleeding gums, weakness, and spots on the skin. Beriberi, from thiamine deficiency, caused nerve problems and heart issues. People didn't understand vitamins, so they just knew that winter made you weak and sick in mysterious ways. When someone in the household got seriously ill, the entire family dynamic shifted. The sick person would be moved closer to the fire, taking up precious warm space. Someone had to stay with them, monitoring their condition, which meant less labour available for other tasks. If the sick person was a primary earner, the economic impact could be devastating. Medical expenses, lost wages, and the cost of special foods for the invalid could push a family to the edge of survival. Folk remedies abounded because people were desperate, and desperate people will try anything. Tying dried fish to your head to cure a fever, drinking water that a sick person had washed in to transfer health, wearing red clothing because red was thought to ward off disease, placing onions around the room to absorb bad air. None of these worked, obviously, but they gave people something to do. Some sense of control over situations that were ultimately beyond their control. Quarantine wasn't really practiced at the household level because it wasn't practical. You couldn't isolate a sick person in a separate room because there were no separate rooms. You couldn't avoid them because you lived in the same space. So everyone just accepted exposure as inevitable and hoped their own immune systems would hold up. Some illnesses came with social stigma. Leprosy, which wasn't actually very contagious but was feared irrationally, could get you expelled from your community. Certain skin conditions were associated with moral failings or curses. Being sick wasn't just physically difficult, it could be socially isolating. The psychological toll of winter illness was enormous. Being sick when you're cold and there's no relief in sight is demoralising. You can't get comfortable. You can't properly rest. Every breath of cold air irritates your already inflamed throat. Your body is trying to fight an infection while also trying to stay warm, and it doesn't have the resources to do both effectively. Families developed their own nursing techniques passed down through generations. How to make invalid food that's easy to digest. How to position a sick person to ease breathing. How to recognise when someone was dying versus when they were just very sick. These were survival skills that everyone needed because professional medical care was either unavailable or unaffordable for most people. Prayer played a huge role in treatment because when medicine doesn't work, faith is all you have left. Families would pray to specific Buddhist deities or Shinto kami associated with healing. They'd visit temples and shrines to make offerings and request divine intervention. They'd have monks perform ceremonies and blessings. It didn't cure bacterial infections, but it provided hope, and hope was a medicine of its own kind. Some people did recover, obviously, because humans are remarkably resilient. Bodies fought off infections without antibiotics. Immune systems rallied despite malnutrition and cold exposure. People survived pneumonia, survived influenza, survived all manner of illnesses that should have killed them. But the survival rate was lower than it should have been, and winter's contribution to mortality was significant. The spring thaw brought not just warmer weather but better health prospects. As temperatures rose, respiratory infections decreased. As fresh vegetables became available, nutrition improved. As people spent less time crowded indoors, contagion rates dropped. Spring was literally a rebirth, a return to health for those who had survived winter's onslaught. But winter would come again, and with it the same threats. The same colds that could turn deadly, the same coughs that lasted months, the same watching and waiting to see who would make it and who wouldn't. It was a cycle that repeated every year, and while some winters were milder than others, the risk was always there. Because in Edo winter, getting sick wasn't an inconvenience. It was a brush with death, a lottery where your ticket was your immune system and the prize was seeing another spring. Modern medicine has made us forget how dangerous a simple cold used to be, how a cough could be a death sentence, how winter itself was a disease that you had to survive. And the people who did survive, who fought through illness without effective medicine, who recovered despite all odds, were tougher than we can imagine. Not by choice, but by necessity. Because in a world where a cold could kill you, every sunrise was a victory, and making it through winter alive was an achievement worth celebrating. The aurora was the beating heart of the Edo home. This sunken hearth in the middle of your floor was where you cooked, where you gathered for warmth, where you socialized, and where you spent approximately 90% of your waking hours during winter. It was fueled by charcoal or wood, whichever you could afford, and it produced just enough heat to keep the immediate area vaguely tolerable. The aurora itself was deceptively simple in design. A square hole, usually about 3 feet on each side, cut into the floor and lined with clay or ceramic tiles to prevent the surrounding wood from catching fire. At the bottom, a layer of ash and sand provided insulation, and a place for coals to rest. Above this, suspended from the ceiling, hung an adjustable hook called a jizaikagi, from which you could hang a kettle or pot at various heights above the fire. That was it. That was the entire heating and cooking system for most households. The positioning of the aurora was crucial. It was typically placed in the centre of the main living space so heat could radiate in all directions, which sounds efficient until you realise that heat radiates up very well, but horizontally not so much. So while the ceiling got warm, everyone sitting around the aurora experienced a strange temperature gradient. Face hot from the fire, back freezing from the room air, top half warm, bottom half numb. You were basically a rotisserie human, requiring constant rotation to heat all sides evenly. Seating around the aurora followed strict social hierarchy. The seat with its back to the tokonoma, the decorative alcove, was reserved for the head of household or honoured guests. This was considered the safest, warmest position. Other family members arranged themselves around the remaining sides according to age and status. Children got the spots closest to drafts. Servants or apprentices, if the household had any, got whatever space remained after everyone else was seated. Democracy had no place at the aurora. The fire itself required constant attention. You couldn't just light it and forget it. Charcoal needed to be arranged carefully to ensure good airflow. Wood needed to be positioned so it burned slowly and completely. The ash layer had to be maintained at the right depth. Too shallow and the fire was too hot, potentially cracking the aurora lining. Too deep and the fire smothered itself. Tending the aurora was a full-time job that usually fell to whoever was home, which meant women and elderly family members became expert fire managers. Cooking over the aurora was an exercise in patience and precision. You couldn't control temperature the way modern stoves allow. You had hot zones directly over the coals and cooler zones around the edges, and you worked with what you had. Kettles hung from the jizaikagi at different heights, depending on how much heat you wanted. Pots sat directly on the coals or on iron trivets. Fish might be skewered and positioned at an angle over the fire. Everything took longer than it should, and timing multiple dishes required the kind of spatial reasoning and planning that would make modern project managers weep with recognition. The smoke situation deserves its own discussion. While the design theoretically allowed smoke to rise and escape through gaps in the roof, or through a designated smoke vent, in practice a lot of smoke just hung around in the room. Your eyes stung, your throat irritated, your clothes absorbed the smell until you became a walking advertisement for wood smoke. Visitors could smell you coming from 3 houses away. But this was normal. Everyone smelled like smoke. It was the Edo winter fragrance, whether you liked it or not. The ash from the Aurori was precious. It wasn't waste, it was a resource. Clean ash was used for banking fires overnight, preserving coals until morning. It was mixed with water to create lye for cleaning. It was added to compost piles to improve soil. It was even used in traditional crafts like pottery glazing. Nothing was wasted, especially not something that resulted from burning expensive fuel. Families would carefully sift through ash to separate the clean stuff from the chunks of unburned wood or charcoal that could be burned again. Nighttime Aurori management was a delicate art. You couldn't let the fire burn all night because that wasted fuel, but you couldn't let it die completely because restarting a fire from scratch in the freezing morning was miserable. So you banked it, carefully covering the hot coals with ash to restrict oxygen flow and slow the burning. If you did it right, you'd have live coals in the morning that could be coaxed back to flame with some gentle blowing and new fuel. If you did it wrong, you'd wake up to cold ash and the prospect of starting over with flint, steel and diminishing patience. The area immediately around the Aurori became the hub of all household activity. People worked there, sitting on cushions or directly on the tatami, using the firelight to see their tasks. Women spun thread, sewed, and prepared food. Men repaired tools and did woodworking. Children did whatever small tasks they were capable of while trying not to fall into the fire pit. Elderly family members told stories, shared wisdom, or just sat and watched the flames because when you're old and cold, fire-watching is both entertainment and meditation. Mealtimes centred on the Aurori for obvious reasons. Food was cooked there and eaten there, with everyone positioned around the fire with their individual bowls. The warmest food went to the most important people, which meant that by the time children received their portions, everything was lukewarm at best. Nobody complained because complaining didn't make you warmer or the food hotter. You ate what you got where you got it and were grateful the Aurori existed at all. The psychological importance of the Aurori can't be overstated. It was the one point of warmth in an otherwise hostile environment. When you were outside working in the cold, you thought about the Aurori. When you were lying in bed, freezing at night, you remembered the Aurori's warmth. When you woke up shivering in the morning, your first thought was getting to the Aurori. It was comfort, safety and survival all rolled into one square hole in the floor. Social visits happened around the Aurori. When neighbours came over, they were invited to sit by the fire, which was both hospitality and practical necessity, because standing around in the cold part of the house would be bizarre. Conversations happened around the Aurori. Gossip was exchanged, news was shared, problems were discussed and solutions were debated, all while everyone rotated slowly to keep all body parts equally warmed. The jizaikagi, that hook hanging from the ceiling, was often decorative as well as functional. Wealthier families had ornate ones carved with auspicious symbols or shaped like fish, which were considered lucky. Adjusting the jizaikagi's height was done frequently throughout the day, as different cooking tasks required different heat levels. It became second nature, a casual movement that happened without thought, like adjusting the temperature dial on a modern stove except way more complicated, and involving a ceiling hook. Some households hung things around the Aurori to dry. Fish, herbs, vegetables, whatever needed preservation through drying. The heat and smoke from the fire would slowly desiccate these items, creating preserved foods that would last through winter. So while you were sitting by the fire, you might also be looking up at a fish hanging above your head, slowly turning into tomorrow's dinner. It was efficient if slightly disturbing. Children had to learn Aurori safety from a young age. Don't fall in. Don't throw things in. Don't knock over the kettle. Don't touch the hot edges. Don't blow ash everywhere. The list of Aurori-related rules was extensive because the Aurori was dangerous. Burns were common, especially for toddlers who didn't yet understand hot versus not hot. Most people carried small scars from Aurori accidents, a burn on the hand from grabbing a hot pot handle, a mark on the leg from leaning too close, a singe on clothing from leaning over to stir something. The Aurori also served as the household timekeeper. How much wood or charcoal remained indicated how much time had passed. When the fire needed refueling, you knew it was time for the next meal or the next task. In a world without clocks for most people, the fire's rhythm structured the day. Morning fire lighting, midday maintenance, evening cooking fire, nighttime banking. Life moved in sync with the Aurori's cycles. Wealthy families might have multiple Aurori in different rooms, which was the ultimate flex. Look at us. We can afford to heat 2 rooms simultaneously. For everyone else, one irori was it, and you arrange your entire life around that single source of heat and cooking capability. If someone needed privacy for some reason, they went to another unheated part of the house and froze in solitude. The irori also had spiritual significance. It was considered the home's sacred centre, and many families believed protective spirits resided in or around it. Offerings might be made near the irori during festivals or family ceremonies. The fire itself was treated with respect, not just as a practical tool but as something almost alive, requiring care and feeding and attention. Cleaning the irori was a regular chore that fell to different family members depending on household dynamics. The ash needed to be scooped out periodically and replaced with fresh sand or ash. The clay lining had to be checked for cracks and repaired. The area around the irori had to be swept because ash and charcoal bits scattered everywhere. It was maintenance on top of maintenance, but necessary maintenance because a malfunctioning irori could mean a house fire or carbon monoxide poisoning. When spring finally arrived and the desperate need for constant fire diminished, the irori didn't disappear. It was still used for cooking, still provided some warmth on cool evenings, and still served as the gathering place for the family. But the pressure eased. You could leave the fire unlit for hours without freezing. You could cook elsewhere if needed. The irori transitioned from survival necessity to convenient tool, which was a relief to everyone who'd spent months as its prisoner. Looking at an irori today, preserved in museums or historical houses, it's easy to underestimate its importance. It's just a hole in the floor with some ash in it. But to the people of Edo winter, it was everything. It was warmth, food, light, and community. It was the difference between making it through winter and not making it. It was, quite literally, the only friend you could count on when everything else was cold, dark, and trying to kill you. Because in a world of paper walls and frozen rice and wind that never stopped, the irori was the one constant source of comfort. It was where life happened, where families came together, where warmth existed in a cold world. And for that, despite the smoke and the burns and the constant maintenance, it was loved. Your clothes aren't just getting dirty, they're disintegrating. The constant wear, the cold, the damp, all of it takes a toll on cotton fabric that was never designed to withstand this kind of abuse. So you patch, and you mend, and you patch again. Your robes become a patchwork quilt of repairs, each one a testament to your determination not to freeze or go broke buying new ones. Let's start with the basic problem. You own maybe 3 or 4 kosode total. That's your entire wardrobe. One you're wearing, one that's being washed or dried, one for special occasions if you're lucky, and maybe one that's so worn out it's been demoted to undergarment status. These garments need to last for years, not seasons, years. Which means they need to survive daily wear, constant friction from movement, exposure to smoke, sweat, and the general abuse of Edo winter life. The fabric itself is fighting a losing battle. Cotton, while durable, has its limits. The fibres weaken over time, especially with repeated washing in cold water with harsh soaps or ashes. The areas that experience the most stress, armpits, elbows, knees, the back of the collar where it rubs against your neck, start to thin first. You can see the fabric becoming almost transparent, the weave loosening, individual threads breaking. It's like watching your clothes age in real time, except slower and more depressing. The first hole appears, usually in a spot you can't easily see, like under your arm or at the back of your shoulder. You discover it when the cold air suddenly has direct access to your skin through your multiple layers. That's how you know there's a new hole. You can't afford to ignore it because one hole leads to 2, which leads to the entire garment unravelling like a sad textile domino effect. So you patch it. Patching is an art form in Edo, Japan, elevated to a technique called sashiko, which involves stitching patterns that not only repair the fabric but reinforce it. You take a scrap of cloth, maybe from a garment that's beyond saving, maybe a remnant you've been saving for exactly this purpose, and you stitch it over the damaged area. The stitching creates geometric patterns, running stitches that crisscross the patch, binding it to the original fabric while distributing stress across a wider area. This work happens by the irori because that's where the light is. You sit with your sewing kit, which consists of needles made from metal or bone, thread that you've spun yourself or purchased from a merchant, and your damaged garment spread across your lap. Your fingers are cold because you've pulled your hands out of your sleeves to work, and cold fingers don't manipulate needles well. You poke yourself constantly, tiny dots of blood appearing on your fingertips that you wipe away before they stain the fabric you're trying to save. The thread itself is a precious commodity. You can't waste it on sloppy stitching or decorative flourishes. Every stitch needs to count to serve a purpose. You measure carefully, you sew tightly, and you knot securely because if this patch fails, you'll need to patch the patch. And at some point you're just wearing repairs held together by more repairs. Some garments become more patched than original fabric. You look at your corsode and realise that the sleeves are from 3 different sources, the body has 7 distinct patches, and the collar has been replaced twice. It's like the ship of Theseus' philosophical question, except instead of a ship, it's your only winter robe, and instead of philosophy, it's desperation. Is it even the same garment anymore? Does it matter? It keeps you marginally warmer than being naked, so you keep patching. Women typically did most of the mending because it was considered part of household management, though everyone in the family learned basic repair skills out of necessity. Children practiced on scraps, learning the running stitch, the back stitch, how to knot thread so it doesn't pull through. By age 7 or 8, most kids could execute a passable repair patch, which was good because their clothes wore out even faster than adults, due to all that running around and playing and general childhood destruction. The colour of patches rarely matched the original garment because you used whatever fabric you had available. This created a quilted, multi-toned effect that was actually considered aesthetically acceptable in certain contexts. There was even a term for it, boro, which referred to heavily patched and repaired clothing. Among the poor, boro wasn't shameful, it was reality. Everyone's clothes looked like this. Walking through Edo, you'd see a sea of patched, faded, repaired garments on bodies that were doing their best to stay warm and dignified. Washing made everything worse. Every time you washed a garment, you weakened the fibres a little more, but you had to wash them eventually because the accumulated sweat, smoke and dirt made them stiff and uncomfortable. So you'd take your corsode to the river or a well, scrub it with ashes or rice bran which acted as primitive soap, and then rinse it in cold water that made your hands hurt. Then you'd wring it out, which put stress on the fabric, and hang it to dry, which in winter meant it might freeze solid before it dried. Frozen clothing was its own maintenance nightmare. You couldn't bring it inside while frozen because the melting would create puddles, but you couldn't leave it outside indefinitely because you needed to wear it. So you'd time it carefully, bringing it in when it was partially thawed but not dripping, and hanging it near, but not too near, the aurora to finish drying. The temperature changes, freeze-thaw cycles, created stress in the fibres that led to more weakening and more eventual holes. Collars required special attention because they rubbed against your neck constantly and absorbed oil from your skin. They wore out fastest and needed replacing or reinforcing regularly. Some people attached separate collar pieces that could be removed and washed or replaced more easily than repairing the main garment. It was modular fashion born of necessity. Swap out the part that wears out fastest to extend the life of the whole. The shoulders of outer garments bore the stress of carrying things. Edo people carried loads on their backs or shoulders constantly. Firewood, water buckets, baskets of goods, children. All that weight pressing down wore through fabric surprisingly quickly. Shoulder reinforcement patches became almost standard, applied preemptively before holes even appeared because you knew they were coming. Knees were another weak point, especially for people who knelt frequently for work or prayer. The constant pressure and friction thinned the fabric until it was nearly transparent. Then it tore. Then you patched it with multiple layers because knees needed extra padding anyway. Walking around with patched knees was so common that it was barely noticeable. Everybody's knees were patched. The hem of your corsode dragged on the ground, collecting dirt and wearing away from friction with tatami mats and dirt floors. The bottom edge would fray, threads pulling loose and creating a ragged border that looked progressively worse. You'd cut away the damaged edge and hem it higher, which meant your robe got shorter over time. A corsode that started at ankle length might end up mid-calf after several years of hem repairs. This was fine, actually, because shorter robes were easier to work in, though they were also colder. Sleeves were a problem area because they caught on things. You'd be working, reach for something, and hear that terrible ripping sound, that meant you'd just torn your sleeve on a nail or splinter or door frame. The long, somewhat loose-sleeve design was elegant but impractical for physical labour. Many working people would tie their sleeves back with cords to keep them out of the way, but that created stress points where the cord wrapped around the fabric, leading to, you guessed it, more holes that needed patching. Thread colour mattered less than thread strength, so patches often appeared in contrasting colours. A blue cassode might have brown patches, or vice versa. Some people embraced this and created intentional patterns, using different coloured threads to make their repair work decorative. If you're going to patch anyway, might as well make it interesting. This wasn't high fashion, it was making the best of a bad situation. The truly poor, those who couldn't afford fabric for patches, would patch with anything, paper sometimes, or thin leather, or layers of plant fibre pounded flat. These patches didn't last long, but they bought time until you could find proper fabric. Every patch was a small victory against the entropy that wanted your clothes to dissolve into their component fibres. Storing clothes when you weren't wearing them meant protecting them from moths, mice and humidity. Clothes were folded carefully and placed in wooden chests or baskets, sometimes with aromatic herbs to deter insects. But in winter, humidity wasn't the problem. It was the cold making everything brittle, and the mice looking for nesting material. You'd open your storage chest to find that mice had chewed holes in your spare cassode to line their nest. More patching required. Some families passed down particularly well-made garments through generations, each generation adding their own patches and repairs until the garment became a textile timeline. Grandmother's cassode, patched by mother, now being patched by you to pass down to your daughter. It connected families across time through the practical act of keeping clothes wearable. The wealthy had it easier, obviously. They owned more garments, could afford better quality fabric and could pay others to do their mending. But even wealthy people patched and repaired because waste was shameful regardless of social class. The difference was that their patches matched better and were executed by skilled professionals rather than by their own cold fingers in firelight. Children outgrew clothes faster than clothes wore out, which created a different problem. You'd patch and repair a cassode, and then your child would grow 3 inches and suddenly the carefully maintained garment didn't fit. So it became hand-me-down to a younger sibling, who would wear it and tear it and require more patches. The cycle continued until the garment literally fell apart beyond any hope of repair, at which point it was cut up and the salvageable pieces became material for future patches. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. By late winter, everyone's clothes looked rough. Months of wear, patching, washing, and general abuse left garments faded, pilled, and held together by stubbornness and thread. But they held together. They kept doing their job. They kept you covered and marginally warmer. And when spring arrived, and you could finally assess the damage, you'd spend the warmer months doing serious repairs, preparing your wardrobe for next winter's assault. Because clothing in Edo winter wasn't fashion. It was armour against the cold, and like any armour, it required constant maintenance. Your needle and thread were as essential as food and fire. And every patch you added was a small rebellion against the forces trying to freeze you naked. You weren't going to freeze, you weren't going to be naked, you were going to patch this damn cassode one more time and survive another day. When it snowed in Edo, it was breathtaking. The city transformed into something out of a woodblock print. White roofs, silent streets, bamboo bending under the weight of powder. It was also a nightmare. Snow meant impassable roads, collapsed roofs, and the very real danger of getting lost and freezing to death on your way to the neighbour's house. The first snowfall of the season was always met with mixed emotions. Children were excited, running outside to catch flakes on their tongues and make footprints in the fresh powder. Adults looked at the sky with dread, calculating how much work this was going to create, how much more difficult everything was about to become. Artists grabbed their brushes to capture the beauty. Everyone else grabbed their shovels and braced for impact. Snow in Edo could be light and fluffy, the kind that dusted everything with a photogenic coating and then melted by noon. Or it could be heavy, wet, and relentless, the kind that accumulated by the foot and stayed for weeks. You never knew which kind you were getting until it started, and by then it was too late to prepare. You just had to deal with whatever the sky decided to dump on you. The immediate problem was roofs. Remember those thatched roofs we talked about? The ones made of dried grass and reeds, they were not designed to support significant weight. A heavy snowfall could accumulate on a roof faster than it could slide off or melt, creating hundreds of pounds of pressure on a structure that was already questionable. Roofs sagged. Roofs cracked. Roofs collapsed, sometimes in the middle of the night, burying sleeping families under a mixture of snow, thatch, and wooden beams. This meant that after every significant snowfall, everyone had to climb onto their roofs with whatever tools they had, wooden paddles, brooms, their hands, and clear the snow before it became a structural threat. This was dangerous work. Roofs were slippery when covered in snow. The angle was steep enough to make footing precarious. Falls were common, and a fall from a roof onto frozen ground could mean broken bones, which in turn could mean death because broken bones got infected, and infections killed you. Some neighbourhoods organised snow-clearing crews who would go from house to house helping elderly residents, or those unable to clear their own roofs. This was community survival in action. You helped your neighbour today because next snowfall you might be the one who needed help. It wasn't charity. It was mutual insurance against winter trying to crush everyone simultaneously. The streets became impassable mazes. Without organised snow removal services, each household was responsible for clearing the area directly in front of their property. This created a patchwork of cleared paths and snow-blocked sections. Main thoroughfares got some attention from city authorities, but side streets and alleys were on their own. Walking through Edo after a heavy snow meant navigating trenches of cleared path separated by walls of packed snow taller than a person. Getting lost in your own neighbourhood became a genuine risk. Familiar landmarks disappeared under white blankets. That distinctive tree, covered. The stone marker you used for navigation, buried. The fence that marked the boundary between properties, gone, at least visually. People would venture out to visit someone 2 streets away and end up disoriented, wandering in circles, their footprints the only indication they'd been there before. Some folks died this way, succumbing to exposure mere blocks from their own homes, because they couldn't find their way back in the whiteout conditions. Snow created work. Constant, exhausting, never-ending work. You'd clear a path in the morning, and by afternoon, windblown snow had filled it in again. You'd clear your entrance, and neighbours walking by would track snow into your cleared area. You'd clear the street, and then it would snow again. It was Sisyphean labour, pushing snow instead of a boulder, with the same sense of futility. Children were both helped and hindered by snow. On one hand, it was magical, a playground that appeared overnight. They'd build snow sculptures, have snowball fights, and slide down any available slope on pieces of wood or straw mats. On the other hand, they still had to do their chores, collecting firewood, fetching water, and doing these tasks through knee-deep snow was significantly harder. A trip to the well that normally took 5 minutes could take 20, and you'd arrive exhausted and frozen. Water collection became particularly treacherous. Wells and rivers didn't freeze completely, but the areas around them became icy and dangerous. You'd approach the well carefully, trying not to slip, and then have to break through ice to access the water below. The buckets were heavier with snow clinging to them. The walk back was more difficult because the path you'd just cleared was already filling in. And when you finally got home, the water you'd worked so hard to collect would start freezing almost immediately if you didn't keep it near the fire. Snow also meant isolation. When travel became difficult or impossible, the city's normal rhythms broke down. Merchants couldn't move goods. Workers couldn't get to jobs. The flow of information slowed to a crawl. If something important happened on the other side of the city, you might not hear about it for days. Each household became an island, connected to neighbours but cut off from the larger world, surviving on whatever supplies they had stockpiled. The beauty of snow was undeniable, though. Moonlight on fresh snow created luminescence that lit up the night in ways that normal darkness never allowed. The silence was profound, snow-absorbed sound, creating a muffled quality that made the city seem almost peaceful. For a few hours after a snowfall, before the trampling and the melting and the dirtying began, Edo looked like a fairy tale setting. Artists captured this in woodblock prints that people still admire today, images of snow-covered temples and people walking with umbrellas through pristine white landscapes. But the people living through it saw something different. They saw the back-breaking work required to maintain those beautiful scenes. They saw the danger lurking under the aesthetic appeal. They saw winter being winter, pretty on the surface, deadly underneath. Snow on the ground created its own hazards. The top layer would partially melt during the day if the sun came out, then refreeze at night, creating a crust of ice. Walking on this was like walking on a frozen lake that might give way at any moment. Your foot would punch through the crust, and suddenly you were shin-deep in snow, off balance, and at risk of twisting an ankle. Every step was a gamble. The weight of snow on tree branches caused them to break and fall. These falling branches could injure people below or damage property. Gardens that families tended carefully all year could be destroyed in a single heavy snowfall. Plants crushed under weight they were never meant to bear. Bamboo, which was used for everything from construction to utensils, would bend under snow loads, sometimes breaking with a crack like a gunshot that would startle everyone within earshot. Melting created its own problems. As temperatures fluctuated, snow would melt and refreeze, creating layers of ice that were even more dangerous than snow. Streets became ice rinks. Steps became slides. The areas around the aurora where snow melted from body heat created puddles that then froze, creating skating rinks inside people's homes. You could slip and fall without even leaving your house. Snow also affected air quality, with more people staying indoors, burning more fuel to stay warm, and ventilation being even worse than usual because nobody wanted to open doors or windows. The smoke problem intensified. Combine that with the snow-trapping smoke at lower altitudes, and you had a city wrapped in a toxic fog of wood smoke and coal fumes. People coughed more, eyes burned more. Breathing felt harder, animals suffered in the snow, birds died from exposure or starvation. Stray dogs struggled to find food and shelter. Even household animals that normally lived outside had to be brought inside, adding to the crowding and smell of human dwellings. Horses and oxen, essential for transportation and agriculture, needed protection from the elements, but also needed to be kept accessible for emergency use. The elderly and infirm were particularly vulnerable during snow events. If they lived alone or with minimal family support, a heavy snowfall could trap them in their homes with no way to get supplies or assistance. Neighbours would check on each other, but sometimes a day or two would pass before someone realised that old widow wasn't coming out, and maybe someone should dig through the snow to her door to make sure she was alive. Snow removal tools were primitive, wooden shovels that worked fine for loose, light snow, but were useless against packed or ice. Brooms that could sweep light dustings but couldn't handle serious accumulation. People's hands and feet, which were free but quickly became numb and painful. The technology for dealing with snow hadn't evolved much beyond move it from here to there somehow, which made every snowfall an exercise in manual labour. Some entrepreneurial individuals made money during snow events by offering clearing services. For a fee, they'd clear your roof, your entrance, your path to the main street. For those who could afford it, this was worth it. For everyone else, it was more DIY winter maintenance added to the endless list of things they had to do themselves. The psychological impact of heavy snow was real. The beauty wore off quickly, usually by day 2, and what remained was the grinding reality of being trapped by weather. Cabin fever set in. Family tensions rose. The isolation, the cold, the constant work. All of it wore people down mentally as much as physically. Spring fever, that desperate longing for winter to end, intensified with every snowfall. Children built snow daruma, snowman-like figures based on the daruma doll, which at least gave them something productive to do with the snow. Adults watched these creative efforts with mixed feelings, glad the kids were occupied, but also aware that the snow used for play was the same snow making everyone's lives miserable. When snow finally melted, it revealed all the things it had been hiding: lost items, accumulated trash, the damage to structures and plants, dead animals that hadn't survived the cold. The reveal was never pleasant. It was like winter taking off its beautiful mask to show its true face underneath, dirty, damaged, and deadly. But then it would snow again, and the cycle would repeat, beauty and danger intertwined, aesthetics and survival locked in and dance that lasted all winter long. The snow would fall, people would marvel at its loveliness for approximately 10 minutes, and then they'd grab their shovels and get to work because beauty doesn't keep you alive. Work does. And throughout it all, the snow kept being captured in art, in poetry, in cultural memory as this gorgeous natural phenomenon, this winter wonder, which it was. But it was also cold, heavy, dangerous, and exhausting. Both things were true simultaneously, and the people of Edo lived in that contradiction, appreciating the beauty while cursing the burden, surviving winter one snowflake at a time. Winter social life in Edo revolved around one simple principle. Whoever had the warmest house won. Neighbours would gather around each other's irori, sharing warmth, food, and the kind of gossip that made the cold almost bearable. These gatherings weren't optional. They were survival strategy disguised as community bonding. Let's be clear about the motivation here. People didn't gather socially because they were bored or wanted to catch up with friends. They gathered because sitting alone in your cold house was depressing and dangerous, while sitting in someone else's cold house with multiple people was slightly less depressing and marginally warmer. Shared body heat was a legitimate resource, and social gatherings were how you accessed it communally. It was thermoregulation disguised as friendship. The wealthiest household in any given neighbourhood became the de facto community centre in winter. Not because they were the most generous or the most friendly, but because they could afford to keep their fire burning longer and hotter. They had more fuel, better insulation, and often slightly larger spaces that could accommodate groups. People would gravitate toward these homes like moths to flame, which is actually a pretty accurate metaphor because everyone was desperately seeking warmth and some of them were going to get burned in the social dynamics. Invitations weren't formal. You didn't send letters or plan weeks in advance. Someone would just show up at your door with the understanding that turning them away meant condemning them to freeze alone in their own house, which was socially unacceptable unless you really hated them. So doors opened, people squeezed in around the irori, and suddenly your quiet evening became a party of 6 or 8 people, all radiating body heat and conversation. The irori seating hierarchy became more complicated with guests. The host got the best seat. Honoured guests or elders got the next best positions. Everyone else arranged themselves according to age, status, and who arrived first. Children were displaced entirely, sent to the cold corners of the room or told to go play elsewhere, which meant go freeze somewhere we can't see you. They'd cluster together in small groups, sharing their own body heat and resentment. Food sharing was expected and carefully calculated. If you showed up at someone's house, you brought something. Pickles, dried fish, maybe some mochi if you had it. This wasn't generosity, it was the entry fee. The host would provide tea or warm water, maybe some rice if they were feeling prosperous, and everyone would share from the communal offerings. Nobody ate much because supplies were limited for everyone, but the act of sharing created bonds and obligations that extended beyond winter. Gossip was the main entertainment. Who was sick? Who couldn't pay their debts? Who had a fight with their spouse? Whose roof collapsed? Which merchant was overcharging for firewood? Who might not make it to spring? The conversation flowed like the tea, warm and continuous, sometimes bitter, always satisfying in that way that talking about other people's problems makes your own seem more manageable. You weren't just cold and struggling. Everyone was cold and struggling, and at least you weren't as bad off as the Tanaka family. Women dominated these gatherings numerically because men were often out working even in winter, and women were more likely to be home managing households. This created spaces where women could speak more freely, share information, provide mutual support, and build networks that operated somewhat independently of male oversight. These weren't feminist consciousness-raising sessions. They were practical alliances where women shared survival strategies, childcare advice, and warnings about dangerous situations or people. Stories were told around the irori, both as entertainment and as cultural transmission. Ghost stories were popular, which seems counterintuitive because being scared while already cold and vulnerable doesn't sound fun. But the thrill of fear distracted from the cold, and the group setting made the fear manageable. Plus, if a story made you shiver, you could blame it on the content rather than the temperature. Convenient. Elderly people were valued at these gatherings because they remembered previous harsh winters and could offer perspective. This is nothing. The winter of 1732, now that was cold. We lost 3 houses on this street alone. Whether these stories were accurate or embellished over time didn't matter. They served a purpose. If our ancestors survived worse, we can survive this. It was oral history as morale boost. Children were sometimes allowed back near the fire for storytelling, squeezed into the remaining spaces between adults. They'd listen wide-eyed to tales of Yuki Onna, the snow woman who lured travellers to their deaths, or Tanuki, the trickster raccoon dogs who transformed into objects to fool humans. These stories scared and delighted in equal measure, and they taught lessons about being careful in winter, about not trusting strangers, about the dangers lurking in beauty. Singing happened occasionally, usually led by someone with a decent voice and a repertoire of folk songs everyone knew. The singing served multiple purposes. It was entertainment, it kept morale up, and it created a sense of unity. When everyone's singing the same song, you're not individuals suffering separately, you're a group experiencing something together. The songs were often about love, loss, seasons changing, or historical events. Nothing too complicated because people were cold and tired and couldn't remember complex lyrics. Work continued even during social gatherings. Women brought their sewing, their spinning, their mending. Men carved wood or repaired tools. Hands stayed busy while mouths talked. This was practical. You couldn't afford to waste time just socializing when work needed doing, but it also gave people something to do with nervous energy and cold fingers that needed movement to maintain circulation. Tea ceremony principles sometimes influenced these gatherings, even in poor households. The act of preparing and serving tea, even rough bancha, was done with a certain mindfulness and respect. The host warmed the cups by the fire first. Water was heated to specific temperatures if possible. The serving followed an order that respected social hierarchy. It brought a touch of ritual and beauty to an otherwise grim situation. We may be freezing, but we're not animals. We have culture. We have manners. Arguments happened, of course. Put 6 cold, hungry, stressed people in close proximity for several hours, and tensions will surface. Someone would make a comment about someone else's patched clothing. Someone would complain about someone else's children being too loud. Old grudges would resurface. But these conflicts were usually managed carefully because you couldn't afford to permanently damage relationships with people you'd need to rely on for the rest of winter. You fought, you sulked, you reconciled. The cycle repeated. Romantic relationships sometimes developed at these gatherings, especially among younger people. Being cold together, sharing stories, sitting in firelight, it created intimacy whether you wanted it or not. Marriages were arranged, but affection could develop anywhere, including around the orrery on a freezing night when someone made you laugh or shared their last piece of dried fish with you. Love wasn't always planned. Sometimes it was just 2 cold people who realized they'd rather be cold together. The concept of reading the room was critical. You had to sense when you'd stayed too long, when your welcome was wearing thin, when the host was running low on tea or fuel and needed everyone to leave. Overstaying was a social crime that would get you uninvited from future gatherings. You watched for subtle cues, the yawning, the fire being allowed to die down, the host mentioning how late it was getting. Then you made your excuses and left, thanking them profusely for their hospitality, even though you'd brought half the food yourself. The journey home after a social gathering was always brutal. You'd been warm, or at least warmer, for several hours. Your body had relaxed, your guard had dropped. Then you stepped outside into the night cold, and it hit like a physical blow. The short walk back to your own house felt endless. You'd arrive shivering, missing the warmth and company you'd just left, facing the prospect of sleeping alone in your cold bed after experiencing communal warmth. Some nights, gatherings would break up late enough that people would just stay over. Not in separate rooms, those didn't exist, but just staying put around the orrery, dozing sitting up or lying down in whatever space was available. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warmer than walking home and trying to restart your own fire. Morning would arrive with bodies everywhere, people slowly waking up, stiff and disoriented but alive. Festivals and holidays intensified social gatherings. New Year was the big one, with families visiting each other, sharing special foods, and making offerings at local shrines. These weren't optional social events, they were cultural obligations that helped maintain community bonds. You might be freezing and starving, but you still showed up for New Year because not showing up meant social death, which in a survival-dependent community could lead to actual death. Gift exchange happened during winter visits, though gift is perhaps too strong a word. More like strategic resource sharing. You'd bring something small, a bundle of dried herbs, a handful of beans, some preserved fruit, and receive something similar in return. Nobody gained or lost materially, but the act reinforced relationships and created social debt that could be called in later. Remember when I gave you those pickles in January? Well, now I need help fixing my roof. Information exchange was perhaps the most valuable aspect of these gatherings. You learned which merchants had firewood, which wells hadn't frozen, which neighbourhoods had illness outbreaks, which officials were cracking down on what regulations. This intelligence network operated through casual conversation, but it was vital for survival. Knowing things before they affected you directly gave you time to prepare or avoid problems. The social hierarchy of winter gatherings revealed community power structures: who spoke first, who was listened to, whose opinions mattered, whose were dismissed. It was a social laboratory where you could observe who had influence, who was rising in status, who was falling. Winter stripped away pretense and left raw social dynamics visible. By late winter, people were exhausted from these gatherings. The novelty of communal warmth had worn off. You'd heard everyone's stories multiple times. You knew everyone's opinions on everything. The gossip was recycled. But you kept going because the alternative was isolation, and isolation in winter could break you mentally before the cold broke you physically. When spring finally arrived, the nature of social gatherings changed immediately. Doors opened, people met outside, conversations happened in gardens instead of around fires. The pressure eased. You could choose to see people because you wanted to, not because you needed to share their warmth. Relationships that had been forged in the cold were tested in the warmth. Some survived, some didn't. Because winter socializing in Edo wasn't really about enjoying each other's company, though that sometimes happened. It was about survival through numbers, warmth through proximity, and sanity through shared suffering. It was huddling together against the dark and the cold, trading gossip for body heat, and hoping that community bonds would be strong enough to get everyone through to spring. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. But every winter people tried again, gathering around fires, sharing what little they had, and proving that humans are fundamentally social creatures who'd rather freeze together than survive alone. If you thought daytime was cold, nighttime in Edo winter was a whole different circle of hell. Temperatures plummeted as soon as the sun set, turning your already freezing house into what felt like a walk-in freezer. The Aurora fire was carefully banked to last through the night, but carefully banked meant barely smouldering, which meant you were on your own. The transition from day to night wasn't gradual, it was a cliff. The sun would set, and within minutes the temperature would drop noticeably. You could feel it happening in real time, the air getting sharper, the cold becoming more aggressive, your body tensing in response. Whatever ambient warmth had accumulated during the day from sunlight or activity immediately began bleeding away through your paper walls into the winter darkness. Darkness itself was absolute. There were no streetlights, no electric signs, no light pollution from neighbouring cities. When night fell in Edo, it fell completely. The city transformed into a black void broken only by scattered points of light from individual homes, and the occasional lantern carried by someone brave or desperate enough to venture out. Inside your house, if you weren't near the aurora or didn't have a lamp lit, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The darkness was thick, tangible, almost oppressive. Lighting was expensive and therefore rationed. Oil lamps required oil, which cost money. Candles required wax or tallow, also expensive. Most families banked the aurora fire and used its fading glow as the only light source. This meant that as the evening progressed, you had less light and less warmth simultaneously. A dual decline that made everything feel like it was shutting down. Activities moved closer to the aurora, people crowding together in the small circle of remaining firelight and heat, like moths desperately clinging to a dying flame. Evening meals happened early, right after sunset, while there was still enough fire to cook and enough light to see what you were eating. After that, there wasn't much to do except prepare for bed. Entertainment options were limited when you couldn't see clearly and needed to conserve both fuel and your own energy. Some families would tell stories or sing quietly. Others would do small tasks by feel, spinning thread, braiding rope, things that didn't require vision. Mostly, though, people just went to bed early because staying awake required resources they didn't have. The process of banking the fire for the night was a ritual everyone knew intimately. You'd let the fire burn down to hot coals, then carefully cover them with a specific depth of ash. Too much ash, and the coals would suffocate. Too little, and they'd burn through all their fuel before morning. It was an art learned through years of trial and error, passed down from parents to children, calibrated by experience and necessity. The goal was to preserve just enough heat that live coals would still exist in the morning, making it easier to restart the fire without going through the entire flint and tinder ordeal. But here's what banked fire meant in practical terms: almost no heat. The ash-covered coals produced minimal warmth. You couldn't sit beside a banked fire and feel warm. You maybe felt slightly less cold in the immediate vicinity, but that was it. For all practical purposes, once the fire was banked, your heating system was off for the night. You were entering 8 or more hours of pure cold with nothing between you and hypothermia except your blankets, your layers, and your family's combined body heat. The sounds of night in an Edo winter home were distinct. The creaking of wooden beams contracting from the cold. The rustle of everyone shifting under their blankets trying to find comfortable positions. The wind howling outside and whistling through gaps in the walls. Someone coughing from the smoke irritation or a cold. Someone's stomach growling from insufficient dinner. A child whimpering from the cold before being shushed. The occasional crack of ice forming in water containers. These weren't comforting sounds. They were the soundtrack of endurance. Sleep itself was elusive. You were too cold to relax fully. Your muscles stayed partially tensed, trying to generate heat through micro-contractions that burned calories you couldn't spare. You'd pull your blankets up to your chin, but that exposed your feet. You'd cover your feet, but then your shoulders got cold. There was no configuration that warmed everything simultaneously. You just shifted between different versions of cold all night long. The air you breathed was frigid. Each inhalation was uncomfortable, the cold air hitting your lungs and making you want to cough. You'd burrow deeper under your blankets, creating a small pocket of warmed air that was humid from your breath and slightly less freezing than the room temperature. But then you'd have to expose your face to breathe, letting cold air in and warm air out. It was a constant negotiation between breathing comfortably and staying warm. Middle of the night bathroom trips were nightmarish. If your bladder woke you up at 2 a.m, you faced a terrible choice. Get up and venture into the freezing darkness to use the benjo, or try to hold it until morning and risk being even more uncomfortable. Getting up meant leaving your blanket cocoon, exposing yourself to the full force of the night cold, navigating in complete darkness, and then trying to rewarm yourself afterward, which could take an hour or more. Many people chose to just suffer and hold it, which created its own health problems, but at least didn't require exposing yourself to potential hypothermia. If you did brave the nighttime toilet journey, the cold was shocking. The temperature difference between under your blankets and the ambient air was so extreme that it felt like jumping into ice water. Your body would seize up. You'd gasp involuntarily. Your teeth would start chattering within seconds. You'd hurry through the house, fumbling in the dark, desperately trying to complete your task and get back to bed before your core temperature dropped too far. The benjo at night was even worse than during the day because now you couldn't see what you were doing and the cold was more intense. You'd feel your way to the structure, manage your multiple layers of clothing by touch, sit on a wooden seat that felt colder than ice, and try to finish quickly while your body screamed at you that this was a terrible idea and you were going to die here. The walk back felt longer. The relief of climbing back under your blankets was profound but temporary. You'd brought cold back with you, and it took forever to warm up again. Children sometimes had accidents during the night because the prospect of leaving their blankets was too daunting. Parents would wake up to discover that a child had wet themselves in their bedding rather than face the cold bathroom journey. This meant dealing with wet, cold futons that would now be even colder and would freeze if not dried near the banked fire, which didn't have enough heat to dry anything. It was a cascade of unpleasantness with no good solutions. Nighttime was also when you'd hear things. Your neighbours through the paper-thin walls, someone arguing, someone crying, someone's persistent cough that suggested they might not make it through winter. Animals outside, dogs, cats, sometimes larger wildlife that had come into the city searching for food. The sounds were amplified by the darkness and the silence, each noise seeming more significant and sometimes more threatening than it would during the day. Some people experience night terrors or vivid dreams brought on by the physical stress of prolonged cold exposure. Your brain, partially deprived of oxygen from shallow breathing and stressed from constant shivering, would create strange scenarios. You'd dream you were warm, then wake up, and the disappointment of still being cold was crushing. Or you'd dream of fire, of burning, while your body was actually freezing. The disconnect was disturbing. Elderly family members often struggled the most at night. Their circulation was poor, their ability to generate body heat diminished. They'd lie awake shivering despite being surrounded by family members and covered in every available blanket. Some of them wouldn't make it through particularly cold nights. They'd simply stop breathing sometime between midnight and dawn, their bodies unable to maintain core temperature any longer. Morning would bring the sad discovery and the grim task of dealing with a body that had frozen in the night. The psychological weight of nighttime was heavy. Darkness plus cold plus isolation, even when surrounded by family, created a sense of vulnerability. You were at your weakest, lying down, unable to see, cold to the point of dysfunction. If something bad happened, a fire, an earthquake, an intruder, you'd have to respond from a position of maximum disadvantage. This created low-level anxiety that made sleep even more difficult. Some households took turns staying partially awake, one person monitoring the banked fire and the general situation while others slept. This wasn't organised guard duty. It was more that someone would naturally wake up every hour or so, check that everyone was still breathing, maybe adjust blankets, make sure no disaster was unfolding, then try to fall back asleep. It was exhausting, but it also made sense. Someone needed to be alert enough to respond if things went wrong. The longest part of winter was the time between midnight and dawn. Those hours seemed to stretch endlessly. You'd wake up, certain that morning must be approaching, and discover you'd only been asleep an hour. Time moved differently in the cold darkness. Every minute felt longer. Every hour was an achievement. Surviving until dawn became a nightly victory that you'd have to repeat the next night, and the night after that. When the first hints of dawn finally appeared, not sunlight yet, just the darkness becoming slightly less absolute, it was a relief so profound it was almost emotional. You'd survived another night. Morning was coming. Soon you could get up, restart the fire, move around, and generate warmth through activity. The day, however cold, was always better than the night because at least you could see and move and do things. Night was passive suffering. Day was active survival. The first person awake, usually whoever was coldest and most desperate for fire, would shuffle to the aurora and begin the process of coaxing life back into the banked coals. This was delicate work. You'd carefully remove the ash layer, exposing the coals beneath. Hopefully some were still glowing. You'd blow gently, adding tiny pieces of kindling, nursing the smallest flame back into existence. When it finally caught, when fire returned to the household, it felt like a resurrection. Light and warmth were coming back. You'd made it through another frozen night. Other family members would wake up gradually, drawn by the sound and promise of fire. They'd emerge from their blanket cocoons stiff, cold, and deeply grateful to still be alive. No one complained about the temperature or the discomfort. Complaining was pointless. This was just how it was. You endured night, welcomed morning, and prepared to do it all again. Because nighttime in Edo winter wasn't rest. It was an ordeal. It was 8 hours of cold that tested your body's ability to maintain temperature, your mind's ability to stay sane, and your will to keep choosing survival over giving up. And every morning that you woke up still breathing, still capable of getting up and facing another day, was proof that you were stronger than the night had tried to make you believe. The darkness and cold would return as soon as the sun set again. But for now, there was morning, and fire, and the small comfort of having survived one more night in the endless winter that seemed like it would never end. Being rich in Edo, Japan didn't mean you were warm in winter. It just meant you were slightly less likely to die from exposure. Wealthy families had larger houses, more servants, and access to more firewood. They could afford thicker quilts, better quality cotton, and sometimes even silk layers that provided marginally better insulation. Let's be clear about what wealth could and couldn't buy in Edo winter. It could buy you more fuel, which meant you could keep your fire burning longer and hotter. It could buy you better quality fabrics that had tighter weaves and better insulating properties. It could buy you architectural features like shoji screens made with higher quality paper that tore less easily. What it couldn't buy you was modern heating technology that didn't exist yet, or insulation materials that hadn't been invented. or any way to fundamentally change the fact that Japanese houses were designed for summer, and winter was just something everyone suffered through. Wealthy merchants and samurai families lived in larger machiya or yashiki compounds that had multiple rooms and sometimes multiple buildings. This sounds luxurious, until you realize it meant you had more space to heat, which was actually harder than heating a single room. Yes, you could afford more firewood, but you also needed exponentially more of it to maintain temperature across a larger area. Most wealthy families dealt with this by heating only one or two main rooms and letting the rest of the house stay cold. So they still ended up huddled in a small space around the orori, just like everyone else, except their small space had nicer furnishings. The quality difference in materials was real but incremental. Wealthy families could afford silk underlayers, which actually provided better insulation than cotton because silk fibres trap air more effectively. They could afford wool, which was imported and expensive but genuinely warmer. They could afford better quality cotton with tighter weaves that blocked wind more effectively. But we're talking about going from freezing to cold, from unbearable to merely unpleasant. Nobody was comfortable. The wealthy just suffered in slightly nicer clothing. Servants were perhaps the biggest practical advantage of wealth in winter. If you had servants, you didn't have to personally venture out into the cold to fetch water from the well. You didn't have to trudge through snow to buy firewood. You didn't have to get up in the freezing pre-dawn darkness to restart the fire. Someone else did these things for you while you stayed in the warmest part of the house. This was enormous. The ability to minimize your cold exposure while ensuring that necessary tasks still got done was maybe the single biggest quality of life difference between wealthy and poor. But those servants, they were having a terrible time. They slept in the coldest parts of the house, wore hand-me-down clothing that was already worn thin, ate after the family had eaten and got whatever was left, and did all the outdoor work that exposed them to the worst of winter. Being a servant in a wealthy household during Edo winter meant you were marginally better off than being a poor person in your own household, because at least you had guaranteed meals and shelter, but you were also dealing with all the worst aspects of winter on behalf of people who stayed inside where it was less cold. Wealthy families could afford better bedding. Instead of a single thin futon on the floor, they might have multiple quilted layers with silk or cotton wadding. They might have proper pillows filled with buckwheat hulls or other materials instead of just folded cloth. They might have bed frames that elevated them slightly off the cold floor. These improvements mattered, but they didn't transform the experience. You were still cold at night. You still woke up multiple times from the temperature. You still faced the same basic challenge of maintaining body heat, while mostly immobile for 8 hours. Food quality and quantity were better for the wealthy, which indirectly helped with winter survival. Better nutrition meant stronger immune systems, more energy, more body fat to provide insulation and reserves. Wealthy families ate more protein, fish, occasionally meat, tofu and eggs, while poor families subsisted mostly on rice and pickles. This nutritional advantage translated to better health outcomes, fewer illnesses, and more resilience against the physical stress of cold exposure. Wealthy families also had access to better medical care, though better is relative because Edo-period medicine was still pre-modern and couldn't do much for serious illnesses, but they could afford doctors' fees, expensive herbal remedies, and the luxury of rest when sick. A wealthy person who caught a cold could stay in bed near the fire while servants handled everything. A poor person had to keep working because not working meant not eating. The architectural differences in wealthy homes did provide some advantages. Thicker walls in storehouses where the wealthy kept their valuables, multiple layers of shoji screens creating air gaps that provided minimal but real insulation, covered walkways between buildings that protected from snow and rain, glass windows which were rare but did exist in some wealthy merchant houses, providing light while blocking wind better than paper screens. These were all improvements that made winter marginally more bearable. Wealthy families could afford specialized winter clothing items that poor families couldn't. Hori jackets made from high-quality silk, furry tanzan coats with thick wadding, imported wool cloaks, proper winter footwear with multiple layers and better water resistance. These items were status symbols, yes, but they were also functionally superior to what poor people wore. A wealthy person could venture outside and return less cold than a poor person's, making the same journey. Some wealthy households had portable heating devices called hibachi or kotatsu. A hibachi was a container filled with hot coals that could be carried from room to room, providing localized warmth. Kotatsu was a low table with a heat source underneath and a blanket draped over it, creating a warm pocket for legs and lower body. These were luxury items that most people never experienced. They didn't heat entire rooms, but they created warm zones that made a significant comfort difference. Bathing was easier for the wealthy. They could afford to heat enough water for private baths at home, meaning they didn't have to make the freezing journey to public bathhouses. Some wealthy homes had dedicated bathing rooms with large wooden tubs. This meant they could bathe more frequently, stay cleaner, and avoid the public health risks of communal bathing. It also meant they could bathe without the ordeal of freezing before, during, and after that poor people experienced. Social status provided psychological benefits too. The wealthy had more certainty about surviving winter. They knew they had enough food stored, enough fuel purchased, enough resources to weather any crisis. Poor families lived with constant anxiety about running out of rice, about not affording enough firewood, about one bad event pushing them over the edge into starvation. That mental stress, that constant worry, was its own burden that wealth could eliminate. Entertainment options were better for the wealthy. They could afford to attend theatre performances, to host parties with special foods and sake, to purchase books or art to enjoy during long winter evenings. These diversions didn't make them warmer, but they made the psychological burden of winter more bearable. Having something to look forward to, something to enjoy beyond mere survival, was a privilege that improved quality of life significantly. However, wealth came with its own winter pressures. Wealthy families were expected to maintain certain standards regardless of season. They couldn't appear in patched clothing or unkempt. They had social obligations, festivals to attend, ceremonies to participate in, appearances to maintain. This meant going out in formal clothing that looked elegant, but wasn't necessarily warmer than peasant layers. Status required performance even when you were cold. Wealthy homes were targets for theft during winter when desperation peaked. They needed to maintain security, which meant paying guards or servants to watch the property, which meant more people to feed and shelter. The responsibility of managing a large household during winter, ensuring everyone was fed and housed and reasonably safe, was stressful in ways that poor families didn't experience because they only had to worry about immediate family. Children of wealthy families were still cold, just cold in nicer rooms. They still got sick. They still suffered from the same illnesses that killed poor children, though at lower rates. They still had to learn lessons, practice calligraphy with cold fingers, maintain behavioural standards even when they were uncomfortable. Wealth didn't grant immunity to childhood misery, just slightly better odds of surviving it. The wealthy elderly had better survival rates because they got the warmest positions, the best food, access to medicine, and weren't expected to work. But they were still old bodies struggling with cold, still vulnerable to illness, still at risk. Wealth extended life expectancy, but didn't eliminate winter's threats entirely. Some wealthy families felt guilty about their relative comfort, which created social obligations to help less fortunate neighbours. They might provide employment to servants who would otherwise starve. They might give food or fuel to temples that distributed to the poor. They might host community gatherings where they provided warmth and food. These acts of charity were partly genuine compassion, partly social expectation, and partly insurance. If the poor got too desperate, property crimes and social unrest increased, threatening everyone. The truly wealthy, daimyo lords and their highest-ranking samurai, lived in castles with stone walls and better construction. But even castles were cold. Stone holds cold remarkably well, and heating massive stone structures was nearly impossible. Lords sat in castles that were defensive fortresses but thermal nightmares, wrapped in multiple silk robes and still freezing. Their wealth bought them safety from enemies, but not from winter. Wealth created options, but not solutions. A wealthy family could choose to spend more on fuel and less on food, or vice versa, without immediately starving. They had buffer. They had reserves. They had the luxury of bad choices that didn't immediately result in death. This is what wealth really bought in Edo winter: margin for error, room to make mistakes, time to adapt. But at the end of the day, rich or poor, everyone dealt with the same fundamental reality. Japanese houses in winter were cold, Japanese clothing was insufficient, and Japanese winter was trying to kill everyone impartially. Wealth was like having better armour in a battle you were still losing, You took fewer hits, your injuries were less severe, and your odds of survival were better. But you were still in the battle, still suffering, still counting days until spring. The wealthy knew this. They didn't delude themselves that they had defeated winter. They just acknowledged that they had better tools for enduring it. And some of them, the thoughtful ones, recognized that their comfort came at the cost of servant suffering, that their warmth required others to freeze on their behalf. Whether this recognition led to gratitude, guilt, or just acceptance varied by individual. But nobody, regardless of wealth, looked at Edo winter and thought it was anything but a brutal test of endurance that everyone in their own way had to survive. Because in the end, winter didn't care about your bank account, it was cold to everyone. Wealth just meant you could afford a slightly thicker blanket to hide under while you waited for spring. The Japanese didn't let a little thing like brutal winter stop them from celebrating. Winter festivals were scattered throughout the season, giving people an excuse to gather, eat special foods, and temporarily forget that their toes had lost sensation. New Year was the big one, marked by elaborate preparations, special meals, and the hope that the coming year would be warmer than the last. Shogatsu, the New Year celebration, dominated the winter festival calendar. It wasn't just a single day. It was a multi-day event that required weeks of preparation and consumed significant resources that families could barely afford. But not celebrating was unthinkable. New Year was when you wiped the slate clean, started fresh, and invited good fortune for the coming year. It was cultural obligation mixed with desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the next 12 months would be less brutal than the previous 12. Preparation began in mid-December with the big house cleaning osoji. This meant cleaning everything, floors, walls, ceilings, storage areas, in the middle of winter when your hands were already frozen and the last thing you wanted to do was expose yourself to more cold while scrubbing. But the cleaning was necessary to sweep away the previous year's bad luck and make room for incoming good fortune. So people scrubbed, freezing and miserable, because tradition demanded it, and hope required it. Special foods had to be prepared, most notably mochi, rice cakes made by pounding cooked glutinous rice until it became a sticky, elastic mass. This was communal work, exhausting work, done in the cold because the rice cooled quickly and needed to be pounded while still hot. Men would take turns wielding heavy wooden mallets, pounding the rice in a large mortar while someone else, usually a woman, would quickly wet and turn the rice between strikes. It was dangerous. Mistiming meant getting your hand smashed, and tiring, but the resulting mochi was both a New Year's food and a preserved food source that would last through part of winter. Families also prepared osechi ryori, special New Year's foods that were cooked in advance and designed to last several days without spoiling. This was practical. It gave women a break from daily cooking during the holiday. But it was also expensive and time-consuming. Black beans, herring roe, sweet-rolled omelette, simmered root vegetables, all of it requiring ingredients that cost money families didn't have but somehow found, because not having proper New Year's food was shameful. New Year's Eve was about purification and closure. Families would eat toshikoshi soba, long buckwheat noodles symbolizing longevity and the crossing from one year to the next. You were supposed to slurp them all the way without breaking them, which was challenging when your hands were shaking from cold and you were eating by firelight. After the meal, families would stay up late or wake up before dawn to visit shrines for Hatsumode, the first shrine visit of the year, praying for health, prosperity and survival. The shrine visits happened in the freezing darkness or frigid early morning, with everyone dressed in their best clothing despite the cold. You'd walk through snow-covered streets to the local shrine, where hundreds of other frozen people were also waiting to pray. The shrine would be decorated with sacred rope and paper streamers. Priests would conduct ceremonies while everyone stood outside in the cold, clapping their hands to summon the kami, dropping coins in offering boxes, and praying desperately for a better year. Children received otoshidama, small gifts of money wrapped in decorative paper envelopes. For poor families, this might be a few copper coins. For wealthier families, perhaps silver. Either way, it was a rare moment when children received something just for themselves, not for survival, but for joy. They'd clutch these envelopes with frozen fingers, already planning how to spend their tiny windfall. Decorations appeared despite the cold. Kadamatsu, Arrangements of pine and bamboo were placed at entrances to welcome ancestral spirits and deities. Shimenawa, sacred ropes made of rice straw, marked purified spaces. These decorations required work to create and install in freezing temperatures, but they signalled to the community and the gods that this household was participating in the renewal of the year, that they were still here, still trying, still hoping. Games were played during New Year celebrations. Hanetsuki, similar to badminton, was popular among girls. Boys flew kites or spun tops. Families played karuta, a card game that required matching poetry. These activities happened in cold houses with numb fingers, but they were moments of genuine fun, rare opportunities to be playful rather than just surviving. Laughter echoed through frozen homes, brief but precious. Other winter festivals punctuated the season. Setsubun in early February marked the transition from winter to spring according to the lunar calendar. It involved throwing roasted soybeans to drive away evil spirits while shouting, "Oni wa soto, fuku wa uchi," demons out, fortune in. You'd throw beans at someone wearing an Oni demon mask, usually a family member who drew the short straw, and then you'd eat the same number of beans as your age for good luck. It was silly, it was cold, and it was a welcome distraction from the grinding reality of late winter. The winter solstice, Toji, was observed with hot yuzu citrus baths and eating kabocha squash, both believed to ward off illness and bring good fortune. Public bathhouses would float whole yuzu fruits in their water, creating a fragrant, slightly acidic bath that was supposed to improve circulation and prevent colds. Whether it worked medically is debatable, but psychologically, the special bath and special food marked the turning point when days would start getting longer, when winter had technically peaked even if it didn't feel like it yet. Festival food was always better than daily food, which was strategic. These special meals provided legitimate nutritional boosts during the hardest part of winter, while also giving people something to look forward to. The anticipation of New Year's mochi, or festival dumplings, helped people endure the weeks leading up to the celebration. Hope, even when tied to something as simple as special food, was a survival tool. Community festivals brought neighbourhoods together in ways that regular social gatherings didn't. Everyone participated, rich and poor, old and young. Status hierarchies loosened slightly during festivals. You might find yourself pounding mochi alongside someone you'd normally never speak to, united in the shared work of celebration. These moments created social bonds that lasted beyond the festival itself, strengthening the community networks that everyone relied on for winter survival. The festivals also marked time in meaningful ways. Winter was long and undifferentiated, one cold day after another with no clear milestones. Festivals broke up the monotony. You could measure progress through winter by festivals. We made it to New Year. We made it to Setsubun. Spring is coming. They were waypoints on a journey that felt endless, proof that time was still passing even when every day felt the same. Music and performance were part of festival celebrations. Street musicians would brave the cold to play shamisen or drums. Local festivals might include kagura, Shinto theatrical dances performed at shrines. Even amateur performances happened, people singing folk songs, telling stories, anything to create entertainment and community spirit. The performances weren't always high quality, but quality wasn't the point. Participation was the point. Creating joy in the face of suffering was the point. Sake flowed more freely during festivals, which helped with both the cold and the morale. Warm sake heated over the aurori and consumed during New Year's celebrations provided genuine warmth alongside the psychological comfort of alcohol. People would toast each other, make declarations of friendship and loyalty, and temporarily forget their various grievances. The alcohol made everyone warmer, louder, and more optimistic about the future, at least until it wore off. Visiting families and friends was expected during major festivals, especially New Year. You'd make the rounds, stopping at multiple households, offering greetings, receiving small amounts of special food and drink at each stop. This created a circuit of social obligations that reinforced community bonds. It also meant walking through freezing streets multiple times, arriving at each house colder than you left the previous one, but the social expectation was powerful enough to override physical discomfort. Children's excitement made festivals special in ways adults had forgotten. Kids didn't worry about the cost of ingredients or the work of preparation. They just knew that festival days meant special food, games, and a break from routine. Their joy was infectious, reminding exhausted adults why they bothered with all the preparation and expense. Seeing a child's face light up at receiving otoshidama or getting to eat mochi made the sacrifice worthwhile. Festivals also had spiritual significance that shouldn't be underestimated. People genuinely believed that proper observation of festivals would bring divine favour, good fortune, and protection. The rituals weren't empty gestures, they were insurance policies against misfortune, appeals to forces beyond human control. When you can't control whether you'll survive winter, appealing to gods and spirits becomes rational behaviour. The festivals were prayer in action, hope made tangible. The contrast between festival abundance and daily scarcity was stark. For a few days, people ate well, wore their best clothes, and acted as if everything was fine. Then the festival ended, and it was back to cold rice and patched robes and the grinding struggle of winter survival. This contrast could be depressing, a reminder of what you didn't have, but most people chose to see it differently. The festivals were proof that better circumstances were possible, that abundance existed somewhere in the world, and that maybe with luck and divine favour, that abundance could become more permanent. Preparation for festivals provided structure and purpose during the darkest part of winter. When everything was survival and drudgery, having a project with a deadline gave life meaning. Making mochi, preparing osechi, cleaning the house. These tasks were exhausting, but they were working towards something celebratory rather than just maintaining existence. Purpose helps humans endure suffering better than resignation. The community pressure to celebrate was real and sometimes burdensome. Poor families would go into debt to afford proper New Year's celebrations because not celebrating meant losing face, which in a community-dependent society could have real consequences. You'd borrow rice, borrow money, promise future labour. Anything to ensure you could participate in the festivals at a level that wouldn't bring shame. The social obligation could be crushing, but it also ensured that festivals happened even in the worst times, maintaining cultural continuity. Post-festival depression was a real phenomenon, though not called that at the time. After the excitement and abundance of New Year, returning to the cold, monotonous reality of midwinter was psychologically difficult. The special foods were gone. The decorations came down. Life returned to survival mode, except now you were also exhausted from the celebrations and possibly in debt from the expenses. January and February, the long stretch between New Year and the eventual arrival of spring, were the hardest months psychologically. But the festivals accomplished their purpose. They broke up winter's monotony, provided social bonding opportunities, offered genuine moments of joy and hope, and marked cultural continuity. They proved that humans could create beauty and celebration even in the harshest circumstances. They were defiance against winter's attempt to reduce life to mere biological survival. They said, "We are still human, still capable of art and ritual and community, still choosing to celebrate life even when life is hard." Because ultimately, festivals in the Edo winter weren't about denying the cold or pretending things were fine. They were about acknowledging the suffering while refusing to let suffering define everything. Yes, we're freezing. Yes, we're struggling. But we're also going to pound mochi, visit shrines, give gifts to children, and eat special foods together. We're going to create joy deliberately, intentionally, in the face of everything trying to break us. And in that act of deliberate celebration, in that choice to gather and feast and pray despite the cold, there was a kind of victory that winter couldn't take away. Outro. So, you've made it through a day in Edo winter. Actually, you've made it through an entire season. The waking up in a paper box, the frozen toilet adventures, the cold rice breakfast, the multiple layers that didn't quite work, the work that never stopped, the firewood that cost more than food, the children with bare feet, the wind that hated you personally, the food that turned into ice sculptures, the illnesses that could kill you, the aurora that was your only friend, the clothes that fell apart faster than you could patch them, the snow that was beautiful and deadly, the social gatherings that were really just communal shivering, the nights that felt endless, the wealth that only made you slightly less miserable, the festivals that gave you hope, and all those animals who were just as cold and confused as you were. And here's the thing, you survived. Not comfortably, not happily. But you survived, which is more than can be said for everyone who faced an Edo winter. Some people didn't make it. Some children didn't see spring. Some elderly folks went to sleep one frozen night and simply didn't wake up. Winter in Edo, Japan had real casualties, real losses, real grief that came with every season. But the ones who made it through, and that's most people, which is itself remarkable, emerged tougher, more resilient, and deeply, profoundly grateful for warmth. They didn't take spring for granted. They didn't waste resources. They understood, in a way we've mostly forgotten, that survival isn't guaranteed. That warmth is precious. That comfort is a privilege. That every sunrise you wake up to see is a small victory against forces that don't care whether you live or die. These people weren't superheroes. They were ordinary humans dealing with extraordinary hardship using nothing but ingenuity, stubbornness, and community. They patched their clothes one more time. They split their last bundle of firewood carefully. They shared body heat with neighbours and strangers. They sang songs around dying fires. They laughed at jokes that probably weren't funny, but helped pass the time. They found moments of joy in a season designed to crush joy entirely. And they did it year after year after year, because what else were they going to do? Complain to winter that it was being unreasonable? Move to somewhere warmer, assuming they even knew such places existed or could afford to get there? No, they stayed. They endured. They adapted. They survived. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your climate-controlled bedroom, under your synthetic fibre blankets, with your central heating humming quietly in the background, maybe take a second to appreciate how impossibly luxurious your life is compared to an Edo winter. You have insulation. You have thermostats. You have hot water that comes out of a tap. You have medical care that can cure infections with pills. You have weather forecasts. You have options. The people of Edo, Japan had paper walls, cotton robes, cold rice, and hope. And somehow they made it work. They didn't just survive. They built a culture, created art, raised families, celebrated festivals, and lived lives that had meaning and beauty even in the harshest circumstances. Their story isn't just about suffering. It's about the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It's about communities taking care of each other because everyone understood that survival was a team sport. It's about finding warmth, not just from fire, but from each other. It's about choosing to celebrate and laugh and sing even when you're freezing and everything hurts. Winter in Edo, Japan was brutal, but the people who lived through it were remarkable, and were here because they were tough enough, stubborn enough, and community-minded enough to keep going when giving up would have been so much easier. So as you close your eyes tonight, warm and safe and comfortable in ways they could never have imagined, remember them. The farmers who worked frozen fields, the mothers who patched clothes by firelight, the children who played in the snow with bare feet, the elderly who shared their warmth and wisdom, the neighbours who gathered around fires sharing stories and survival. They made it through, winter after winter after winter, and their perseverance, their resilience, their refusal to let the cold defeat them. That's woven into history, into culture, into the very fabric of what it means to be human. Sleep well, stay warm, and be grateful, because you're living in the future that all those frozen people in Edo were hoping would be better. And it is. It really, really is.